Welcome. Call this meeting to order. If you could please join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Amy, would you take a roll call, please?
Mrs. Pauling.
Here.
Mr. Gilbert.
Here.
Mr. Detzel.
Here.
Mr. Heaton.
Here.
Mrs. Slatter.
Here. And to start the meeting, we need a motion to adopt our agenda.
So moved. Second.
I just want to start by thanking all of you for being here tonight. I know we've been together multiple times lately and just really appreciate you guys taking the time to be with us and to talk about this. Our why for being here is we've had several recent events, obviously, within our district. And we also hear concerns from staff, parents, community members around student behavior. And just we hear it's the same students over and over. And we want to support all of you. What our role is to set policy, and we cannot do that without hearing from you guys who are the experts and who live this every day. So in order to set those policies, we need you to share concerns, share what's working, share things that are going on, and how we can be of support. Erin is here to help us from a legal perspective, and we appreciate you being here. And then Daryl, I'll turn it over to you for your agenda.
So we'll start with a couple of things. We want to start with, because we have some newer board members and some newer administrators, we want to start with just doing some introductions around the inner circle. And then we'll talk about norms for the meeting and kind of our agenda for how we're going to move through today. So I'm Daryl Yater, superintendent for the district.
Erin Westendorf-Wortman, one of the approved councils for the Board of Education.
Dustin Gehring, Director of Student Services.
Kristen Brody, Principal at White Oak Middle School.
Erin Davis, Principal at Colerain High School.
Matt Hawes, Assistant Principal at Colerain High School.
Jay King, Assistant Principal at White Oak Middle School.
Kristen Castile, Administrator at Transitions Academy, also one of the district's licensed social workers.
Ali Moore, Principal at Colerain Middle School.
Amy Wells, CFO Treasurer.
Anthony Gaines, Assistant Principal at Northwest High School.
Sarah McMullen, Assistant Principal at Northwest High School.
Nancy Slattery.
Art Gilbert.
Nicole Tolby.
Chris Heather.
Jim Detzel.
Matt Pining, Interim Principal, Northwest High School.
Karen Hood, Principal at Struble Elementary.
Riley Stevens, Assistant Principal at Struble Elementary.
Ryan Whitaker, Assistant Principal at Montford Heights.
Colin Clymer, Principal at Colerain Elementary School.
Annie Brewer, Assistant Principal at Colerain Elementary.
David Berry, Assistant Principal at Pleasant Run Elementary.
Jamel Weathers, Principal at Pleasant Run Elementary.
Allison Driesbach, Principal at Pleasant Run Middle School.
Casey Schurz, Principal at Taylor Elementary.
Gina Sansoni, Principal at Houston Early Learning Center.
So appreciate everybody being here tonight and being part of the conversation. The board has been very engaged and interested in having collaborative conversations, and we appreciate that about our board. We're going to start with some norms. The people on the inside of the circle are the people who are closest to the running of the building, the student management systems, and the implementation of and operationalizing of our policy and procedures. So the conversation will live within this inner circle. We have an outer line of other district administrators who might have some context from their perspective who may be able to join the conversation. And then we have seats beyond that, and everyone who is in a seat is a spectator. So as a work session, it's an opportunity for the board to engage in specific collaborative conversations with a small group of people. There is not an opportunity for public comment or other questions outside of the people in the circle. So the conversation will stay here. We are going to talk about policies and procedures, and we're going to talk at a global level. Because of FERPA and other revised codes around privacy, we are not able to talk about specific incidences, about specific students, about student situations. So this is going to be very much at a policy and procedure level. not at anything specific. We are going to go through a couple of things through our agenda. We'll start with some legal references. We're going to review for the board and everyone in the room around some of our district procedures we follow, just so everybody's on the same page. And then we'll review some of our data. And then throughout that conversation, it is an open conversation. So as we go through that, all of the administrators on that inner ring are going to be able to interject, talk, share some of their experiences with the board so that you can hear what they need in order to be more effective and supported in their role. So with that, we're going to start with Aaron going through some norming around just policy and law.
So I know we'll talk in a little bit about where all of the legal sort of references are for removals, suspensions, expulsions, what it means to actually do that in the Ohio Revised Code. But as a Board of Education, you also have a number of policies that already exist in your Neola policies on all of those pieces. Just as a reference to level set, and in case any of us want to go back and say, hey, what board policy actually does this? It's in your 5,000 levels, starting at 5,600 for student discipline, and goes all the way through setting your due process rights, and includes what maybe more specifics look like for emergency removals, in-school suspensions, does some minor modifications to what can be done when a student would bring on a weapon on campus, things like that we can talk about. That statute gives you the power to make changes in policy, which is where you all tend to set the direction of the board through that policy, and it's within these policy sections that happens.
So we want to start with just kind of norm setting around how, as a district, we follow a very collaborative process to make sure that the voices who are closest to the situations and the operation of the building are the loudest voices in setting the procedures of the district, and that they kind of help us understand what they need on an annual basis. So Dustin's going to talk a little bit about this, and I'm sure our administrators will chime in with their experience with the process and some of the things they've been able to advocate for.
Setting the course for next year begins around right now, in the spring, where we begin to have conversations. We have an annual conversation, and we have for every bit of 7 years around talking through the code of conduct. What changes do we need to make, specifically around codes? In our world, we call this the support guidelines and code of conduct, because in that document, which is public facing in here, it talks about on the front end, how do we support students in need, but then also on the back end are reactive measures as well. And so both parts of that document get discussed by groups every single spring. During those conversations, we open dialogue around what are you seeing that isn't represented yet in the codes? How often are you seeing it? Is it a one-off, or are we seeing a trend here? And so we've seen some code changes so that when we do issue discipline, we want the codes to match the story. So that when we follow the codes and follow the story, they should be in an alignment with each other. Why do we choose this code versus that code, and how did it match up with the story? There are circumstances as society has changed and outcomes have changed where we need new codes because new things are happening in our world. And so we do that work together. In addition to the codes themselves, we set and collaborate around what are the outcomes at each level. So though an administrator at any point can certainly skip levels of discipline for any code, they're not stuck to it. We do talk about a norm around what's the range here for a code that's in the 100 level codes or the 200 level codes, 3 or 4. And we also look at staff responses in that same world, so that our teachers can understand, if we feel like as a staff, this is a 100 level code or a 200 level code, here's our common responses to that, and then it goes to the administrator. And then also what to expect from the administrator. What are some common responses from our administrative teams around the area of code in the 1, 2, 3, or 400 level code? And so every year we bring about some changes. And I know that as a group, we've discussed a little bit around each year what we're getting ready for this year. And we're already talking a little bit as a group, we need a code like this, or we're missing this, and we've added this new discipline piece at a particular school or at all schools so that it does match up.
And this will be coming back to the board. It comes annually, so
Yeah.
around the June time frame, you'll be seeing the revised code of conduct coming back to you after it goes through a process of engagement with our administrators.
And before we shift gears, just want to open the room. Obviously, I don't want to speak all the time, so as a team, are there thoughts around that process?
Well, it's a very collaborative process. I've
had the fortune of sitting on that committee for 9 years. I remember doing it with Pauletta Crowley before Dustin did it. As a dean of students at Pleasant Run Middle School, I worked at Northwest Passage Transition Academy for a while, now at the elementary world. They do a good job of bringing all stakeholders to the table, like dean of students, counselors, building leaders, and we have good discussion about, disrespect to students with physical contact. There might be a little bit difference between, a kid that accidentally hits somebody between somebody that actually gets punched. Bus issues, some different things have occurred with transportation that we want to try to support the drivers. So we're making sure to bring those people to the table and making sure that we get their input on different situations as well. But the district's been great about making sure that we bring all the kind of people to the table and make sure that everybody's opinion's brought forth to take care of the kiddos.
I can speak just having been part of it last year too, specifically what codes we added. We added a code 431, which is a violation of a student while in probationary period. So a lot of times during our suspension or expulsion process, students will be held in abeyance. That's their probationary period. During that time, if a student does act up while they're held in abeyance, we can use that code to bring them back to the table to have a conversation again. Another code that we just recently added was non-confrontational physical conduct. So not necessarily a fight, but students horsing around in the hallway. Obviously, it doesn't bring it to the level as a fight. So that's two that have come out of it since I've been a part of it.
Matt, you had made mention around, like, looking at codes. One of the things that, stands out to me that we do is kind of nice is we have collaborative conversations around how, or things we're seeing that might be different that we've seen in years past, and we go through a process of that of, do we need something else? Do we need to look at something else? Are there things that could fit in things we already have? So things that are coming up that we're not used to seeing or haven't seen, we're allowed to have that kind of conversation as well. And it just helps us as a team when we're in the room at all the different levels. I know I've been at several levels as an administrator, but having those conversations and what it looks like here, what it looks like there at middle school, high school, elementary is kind of nice too.
I think a primary example is, this past year, we talked about, smartwatches was especially at the elementary level. It was like all of a sudden we were like, oh, second graders have smartwatches. What are we gonna do with that? And what are the rules around that? And so that would be a primary example of the things that the changes that we talk about.
So whenever we add a code, we talk about where does it land? Because it represents a behavior. Is it a 100, a 200, 300, 400? And then we also talk about responses. Sometimes those conversations are flipped. What would be a typical response if that showed up? Okay, does that make sense here? Or did people around the table have a different feeling? And so we take pretty extensive notes in the comment section of the document, and then we go back through and I clean them all up so people don't watch me type for an hour, but then we send it back out. Does this meet your needs? Does this make sense? Does this match? And so we send it right back out. And this is work that happens before it comes to you as a part of our code of conduct itself, but then each handbook. Each handbook has this land inside of it so that it represents the codes. One of the pieces of this conversation is consistency. And so by level, we start talking about common occurrences. What are things that we have seen a number of times, and what's our common occurrence? What can we agree upon around an outcome around a particular behavior? And so if we have a particular behavior that's been there and we see it across 3 levels, what does each level want to agree upon that most often will represent the outcome? Now, there's always chances to say, well, we want to go up or down according to the circumstance, but where do we start? Okay, and so a conversation around Nerf guns, and what do we want to do with that across the board? Where do we start, and what are the questions we need to ask ourselves when we decide if we're going to do something different? And so we have those conversations annually, but also all the time, but it does live annually in the spring. So I'll let the team speak at all around the consistency process.
I think I can speak specifically to this, having been in a number of different districts, and it's been incredibly helpful, like, coming into this space. I haven't seen this level of, like, consistency and collaboration around, like, shared consequences or shared conversations, and that's been incredibly helpful for me, like, as a new administrator inside of the district, to be able to pick up the phone and call Dustin or Ali or call Allison, or any of the assistant principals, so I can just speak to, like, the collaboration and communication that we all have around discipline happens pretty frequently.
I think the process allows you to keep the code of conduct up to date as much as possible.
To Dustin's point, there are always new things that are happening. Kids find different ways of getting into mischief, and we're like, I never thought of that. And so it allows us to be up to date with it as much as possible, to maybe create new codes that need to be put in, or to modify perhaps existing codes so that we can, again, be as current as possible.
One of the outcomes of the conversation this year, as a middle school principal, want to talk about the discussion that we had around outcomes around physical conflict. I know that was a big piece for this previous spring, if anyone would like to speak to that, because we saw some changes in our outcomes, our consistent outcomes around fights.
Are you talking about in what we're doing as far as operations and how we've been
More of the discipline outcome.
in our reduction in those occurrences from happening based on certain things that we've implemented this year?
First-time fighter. So
Yes.
first-time fighter outcome this year versus last year. We chose to go up from 3 days to 5.
5.
So that was a conversation amongst the middle school principals. Where do you want to land? How does that support our high schools? Is there a giant gap between an 8th grader in the spring and a 9th grader in the fall as far as the outcome for any first-time fight? And can we close in that gap to help kids understand what they're preparing for, but also still be reflective of middle school?
With that change, have you had more kids fighting or less kids fighting, going from 3 days to 5 days for their first time fight?
I'm not sure that necessarily the increase in the 5 days is the decrease that we've seen overall in fighting. It's what we do when we bring them back, having those restorative conversations, talking about what led to the action. We're now requiring reentry meetings after those occurrences so that we have the parent and the student at the school with us, talking about the things that they did and how we're gonna do that differently next time, and what supports and resources they have available to not allow that to get to that point the following time. So I think that's really what has had the impact to the reduction that we've seen, is kind of those extra layers and extra steps that we've taken to be able to reduce those occurrences.
And in addition, not even when they're returning, but what we're doing before they go out. You know, being able to have conversations with students. When teachers inform us or other students inform us that students are having issues with each other, we're able to do some collaborative work with them, some restorative conversations, meeting with counselors, bringing parents to the table, but doing whatever we can to intervene before it becomes physical. You know, the last thing we want to do is put a kid out of school. So we're trying to do everything we can prior to that to, you know, help mediate or problem solve. And I think that's one part that's leading to a reduction in suspension, in fights rather.
You kind of led right into proactive strategies.
So one of the things that we do approach this work with is just to be on the front side of it. And one piece of that front side is the RISE acronym that we've instilled across our district. So the RISE acronym really talks about, if you want to go forward for me, around the 4 concepts of how we do make shifts in our buildings regarding student behavior. So there's a philosophical belief that these are the 4 things that are going to most impact students' choices and, of course, behaviors as well, which, of course, the behavior that impacts the discipline. But on the front side, we want our students to behave and meet expectations. And so to do that, we do work in all 4 of these areas. We do work around on purpose building of relationships, being skilled around that, ensuring that our teachers are skilled around that as well, and having the lens that they need to work with their students. Great instruction. We know that great instruction has a huge impact on behaviors, and not by accident, but every classroom, every day, that our teachers are ready to do their absolute best work. We know that where there's great instruction happening, we're not seeing behavior issues, and that's the absolute truth. And so we work with our staff to ensure that great instruction's happening. A ton of work this year around structures, and one of the things that Mr. Gaines was alluding to as well is on the front side, being out there and being present, reducing unstructured time, and then, of course, having heavy supervision around times in which you do have to have unstructured time. You have to have hallway passes. You have to have lunch, arrival, dismissal, to ensuring that we have lots of supervision in those spaces, because many students will not engage in that behavior when an adult is only a few feet away. And so ensuring that we're building those capacities has had some great fruit. And then also expectations, okay? Making sure that our students understand what's expected of them in each of the environments. And if there's a misunderstanding, we're correcting that, and we do it individually as we need to. So that comes through our PBIS model. PBIS is not standalone as a token economy, but it's a system to ensure that students understand expectations around hallways, classrooms, lunchrooms, bathrooms, you name it, in those spaces, different expectations. So I want to let the team talk a little bit around ways in which they've implemented any part of the RISE acronym that we've been using this year.
So, one of the things at Pleasant Run Elementary, and I know some of our other elementary buildings in the district use it, is, I don't know if people in the room have heard of Kid Whisper, but our district has offered for the past couple summers a workshop free of cost for our staff. And behavior leadership really talks about relationship building skills, and that can be done in a lot of those different ways in instruction, structures, and expectations. Our staff has used that. A lot of our staff has been trained in that. They've gone to the workshop. Some of them have gone multiple times, and it really it teaches them different strategies on how to avoid conflict, how to not escalate students. Providing structure in the day for our students with real-world workshop, which is giving students structure about their class time. So they will have a list of now and laters. So those students know that when they come in that day, they're going to be doing these items as their nows, and once they complete their nows, they get to move on to their laters. Standing outside their door at the beginning of the day, greeting their students, walking their students out to buses at the end of the day. So our staff's done a really good job with that relationship building piece, and the educational leadership skills that they've learned is a huge part of kind of the decrease in behaviors that we've seen in our building at Pleasant Run.
I would say, just speaking at the elementary level in general, so we spend a lot of time teaching kids how to do school, right? Some of our new students, our kindergartners, this may be their first time in introduction to a structured learning environment. So I completely agree with Dave, and I'd say if you asked all of the principals here, there's at least a handful or more of staff members who have participated in the free professional learning with regard to Kid Whisper. It's sprinkled in, I think, to all of our buildings. But on that screen, the two most important things that we work on first at the elementary level, and I'm sure at other levels as well, is building relationships and expectations. Because if you don't have that settled first, then you can't get to the part of the strong instruction. There'll be other things in the way. So I know at our building, and I'm sure at other elementary buildings, we take the first few weeks of school, we stay away from content, and we work on relationship building, creating a family atmosphere in classrooms so kids understand their role and purpose. Their job is to come to school to learn, and our job is to teach them all they need to be able to be a successful student. And then in terms of expectations, that's something that's ongoing in all of our buildings. We were just talking after school today about doing a start of Q4 reboot because spring's coming and people are getting a little antsy, right? Our fifth graders are feeling that middle school vibe. And so we want to make sure that we are prepared to provide strong instruction through the end of the school year. And so revisiting those pieces is always an important part of the work that we do. I had a conversation with one of our partners recently that's new to our building and just checked in on her, and she said, wow, I've noticed that you spend a lot of time being proactive at your building so you can spend less time being reactive. And I think that's something that we all really try to impress upon our staff members as important.
And that consistency piece is important because I know it's a daily basis. We're telling the kids, take care of yourself, take care of others, take care of Montford Heights, do things the Cardinal way, do things the Knight way. Like it's throughout the district, that PBIS model where we want our kids to, make sure they're not just taking care of themselves, they're taking care of others, they're taking care of their community, and they're being those proactive members.
And those are life skills.
They really are.
Right?
Yep.
You do those three things, whoever you are, you're going to be successful.
Absolutely.
White Oak, we are trying to continue teaching our kids transferable skills, so we do become proactive. We set up a system with our counselors, so if students have conflict with other students, know that their friend may be getting into situations, they can send a message through Google Forms like, hey, I think there might be some conflict between two of my friends, so teaching them how to advocate not just for themselves but for their peers will help them go a long way in our future and then help keep us ahead of things like we need to learn how to come sit down at the table, talk about our feelings. what happened in the situation, because a lot of times things get misconstrued once we get multiple voices in, and then it leads to unexpected situations and circumstances.
We have, we have the PBIS app that we use across, I know all the elementaries use that app. And as a PBIS team, we meet regularly, monthly, and we look at some areas in which, you know, we're seeing an influx of referrals in certain kinds of criteria. And so we literally will sit down as a team. We've got some staff members, some teachers on that committee as well who work very hard, do a great job to kind of be the voice of the staff. And then we are purposely creating opportunities for what we call pop-up point type things, where we focus on those areas that we're seeing an increase, and we flood the kids with positive when we see those good choices being made, so that they understand, you know, we're in a business of kids. That's our job, is to teach kids, and something that everybody at this table, I think, takes a pretty significant stance in and want to do what's best for our community. So
That is something we're also implementing at White Oak, looking at the PBIS, working with the teams, creating challenges for the month of January. We rewarded our kids who didn't have referrals. We're trying to hit people. Not everyone is a scholar, honor roll, straight A student. Some people come, we never have problems. February, we looked at attendance, trying to get no unexcused absences, multiple tardies, trying to get those numbers up, because during this time it really starts to hit with the weather being all over the place. March, we're doing around our MAP incentives, so students, and highlighting students who reach their goals. So every month we want to look, hey, this is our focus, and then that's based off of previous data, that areas we need to work on to continue, like, hey, we see you, we recognize you, we are here for you, and we want to celebrate you.
What I was gonna talk about a little bit is operational structures. I think that's been something that I felt a little bit different from CSO, is that this year they took an interest in coming to each school and walking with building leaders to actually, when you talk about how do you do arrival and dismissal, what does your lunchtime look like, they're actually within the space when you're talking about it. That is something that I've noticed that has been implemented this year as well. So it's not just, do you have your structures in place, but they've taken the time to, I know Chris McKee's come over, Daryl's come over, Dustin's come over, and they are in this space as building admin are talking about what does it look like. And I've liked that, because then it brought up just conversation about, like, well, if this happens, how would you do this? So then it naturally led into conversations of problem solving and thinking through things before the year really got started. So that is something that I've noticed has been a change this year in terms of structures, but I just wanted to add that piece.
Since people have kind of brought PBIS up, Aaron was going to touch base on just some of the legal references around PBIS, and then we can talk about the system of PBIS, because a lot of it gets focused on the rewards.
I feel like, and now for your legal citation, which is also fine. It's perfectly acceptable. So the revised code 331946 does require you, so you're mandated by the state to set your, and implement PBIS framework and a policy. You have it already set in your policy 563001, so you do have that. And then from there, there's an administrative code that the Department of Education and Workforce sets forth what those standards are. You are required to make reports under these systems to the Department of Education and Workforce. And if we're still catching up, that is the new ODE. Okay.
So one of the things that, before we go forward, to think about PBIS, there's actually frames of PBIS. I think one stands out as a token economy. We hear a lot about, well, if students behave positively, they have an outcome. So Jay referenced, you know, White Oak's focus on attendance, and so they were able to have a celebration of, hey, great news, you had no unexcused absences for the month of February, and so you got to come to the most amazing DJ in Cincinnati performing inside your gym right there at White Oak Middle School. And so they got to come in, play basketball, volleyball, and then they also had some music playing and had a great time. And so things like that do exist as a token economy, and every building has that slice of PBIS. In addition to that is the matrix. Every one of our buildings, as required through this progression, has a matrix around behavior. And so expectations in every environment are described to say, here's what we do expect of you in the cafeteria, in the lunch, or in the hallway, in the classroom, in the community. And so when a kid doesn't meet those expectations, we don't stop and say, well, you should have known it by now because you're whatever age. We say, okay, you don't clearly understand that expectation. Let's go back and reteach it. And so we have anchor documents and anchor visuals around buildings that we can take a kid to, and the team does, and say, listen, hallways look like this. And that's not what we were meeting. We weren't meeting that expectation today, and therefore. And they use progressive, whatever they need to ensure that the students do begin to learn that. One other slice of PBIS is in front of you, which is the intervention tier system. So this is parts of PBIS people don't always realize because you hear about the token economy. But in addition to that, the intervention is around what are we doing when a kid needs more beyond others or different supports beyond others. So at the bottom of this framework is our universal supports. And I don't expect you to read all those. They actually live in the support guidelines that you have access to. But it talks about what does everyone in our district have at their disposal as a support. Every kid has these things. Beyond that, we know that students have different needs. And so whether it be tier 2, low tier 2, high tier 2, where we start saying, well, this kid needs a bit more or something a bit different. And so kid by kid and season by season, this team is able to work with members of a larger team to say, we need some ideas on how to support this kid in this space. And then as we get to tier 3, those are our most significant interventions. And so this is a very small population of kids that need a bit more beyond tier 2. And so you see some pretty significant supports there that do exist. So inside of PBIS, you have all these slices that exist and beyond the token economy that make it work. And a lot of it is being proactive and in front of it, and also having a system that kids can work in and out of around their supports. Before I leave PBIS, I know we've talked a bit about it. Does anyone around the circle want to talk about the interventions, how that works, or anything?
So I want to say one of the things that I think is best about PBIS is the fact that it gives us a universal language. If you come into Struble, you can ask a kindergartner, a third grader, or a fifth grader, what does it mean to be at level 1, level 2, level 3, and level 0? Having that means that at any point, everybody in our school understands what the expectation is and is able to address any student at any time, because those are universal. Along with that too, we also empower our students to take ownership of that. When we were applying for our PBIS award last year, we had somebody come in from the state, and she talked about how wonderful it was that we had the pictures of our students displaying those behaviors. So if we see somebody that's doing something that they're not supposed to, we have that visual right away, and it's their own peers doing that. And I think that that is what's so important. Obviously, the token economy, having students feel like their good behavior is being rewarded is very important, but having everybody on that same page, knowing exactly what the expectations are and having that laid out for everyone has been just wonderful.
Can somebody explain the app that
Oh, yeah.
you were speaking about?
So at any point, if I see a student that is doing what they are supposed to do, I can pull up my PBIS app and I can type in their name, and then I can check for whether or not they were taking care of themselves, taking care of others, or taking care of Struble. So that makes it really beneficial to have at all times, because I'm not walking into the cafeteria with my computer. I've got my phone. However, then this also links to the PBIS rewards website, and that's where we're able to track our student data. Going back to like the pop-ups, our big focus for this month is taking care of others. The students that have the most points for taking care of others are going to have Pops with Cops. Coleraine Police Department has nicely provided popsicles, and they're going to be coming in on the 15th to have popsicles with our students that are taking care of others. We're able to track all of that data, and then that sort of impacts where do we go next. When we have those PBIS meetings, we look and see, all right, we're doing really good at taking care of ourselves. This month we need to focus on taking care of others. It also is a really nice tool to use in the classroom as well, because if you've got a couple of kids that are doing what they're supposed to be doing and a couple that are not, I'm gonna pop up those points and those kids are gonna hear that ding, and it sort of gives that very quick hey, reminder without having to point out who's doing something wrong.
It goes back to the kid whisperer stuff that David was talking about. And the system is called PBAS rewards. Like, it's not like we're giving a kid a reward every time this happens, but the system itself is called PBAS rewards. So every time you hear the word rewards, it's not like we're giving a kid something. The system is actually called PBAS rewards.
Yeah, there's other systems too, like we've used
Live
Live
School.
School in the past, things like that. That's just that particular one that we
And
purchased.
families, talk about the family.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I was gonna say, and also.
I was just showing him.
Yeah, I was gonna say, would you like to talk about the family aspect of it? How do you see what you get?
Yeah.
So it's a really
It's
nice
nice.
way to communicate with families that lets them know, what are my kids doing? Where are they earning these points? Like, we can track it down to, you know, what time of day is this happening at? Where's this going? And so it's just as a really nice way for us to be able to model and reflect on the data on what it is that we need to do to help impact student behavior. And also a nice way to make sure that students that are doing what they are supposed to be doing get that affirmation. Yeah.
So at the preschool level, we don't use the app because our kids don't understand, like, earning a point, because they're 3 and 4. But they certainly understand a stamp, and they love that. So we are old-fashioned, which many of us, when PBS kind of first started, is the old-school kind of card with your name on it, or some of our kids don't know their names yet, so it has their picture. And they very much know that they're earning a PowerPoint, and they go get their little card out of a pocket chart, and they physically put a stamp. Some teachers use stickers, and then automatically something is sent home, like a description of why, because a lot of our kids are nonverbal, or they're too young to remember why they got rewarded an hour later, right? But that way our families, it still has the family piece, so every time they're awarded, there is a slip that goes home that says, you know, your child was being kind, or they sat for the, you know, circle time and was attentive to the teacher. And then there's same sort of thing that it kind of mirrors it. It's just a paper copy of it. Then they fill up their card. They earn something. So it can be very individualized. And kids, the nice part is there's always like a store for, you know, once they earn their points. There's like the elementaries have like stores that they go and shop at, and so the kids it allows students to have choice in what they're earning, because every kid, some kids work for things that are more like a puppet or something like that, where other kids want to eat lunch with a counselor.
Yep.
Like, that's more meaningful to them than having something. So it really meets the needs of the individual kids.
Before we leave this, one thing I know, we talk a lot about their PBS reward system and how that works, but one of the things that's embedded in here that is not necessarily as prominent and prevalent for a lot of people is the kind of supports that you guys have embedded in your buildings around when students are struggling in a classroom environment, how you are able to support them to address that and re-enter a classroom and be more prepared to learn. So if you want to talk about that side of your system, I think that would be a fruitful conversation as well.
So when teachers have students that need just a break, a reset of some kind, they can call and request support from the office. And so it would either be our ALP person, our owner learning program person, their assistant, it could be a counselor, could be an administrator, a dean, whoever is available at that time to go, and we have an opportunity to take them out of the classroom, have some conversation, try to give them a reset. I believe every building, pretty much, I know elementary, I think a couple, I know White Oak, I believe, has it. We have a place that's called the Mindful Nest. That's what I have. It's a kind of a zone room or what have you for students to go and kind of get a reset, go through a specific program, de-escalation strategies are taught, those kinds of things, and revisited with the students in hopes to get them back to class. Could be a case where something might have happened in the morning prior to school starting, overnight, where they're just not ready to come in and learn right away at 9 o'clock with, here's the standards, here's what needs to be covered, and here we go. And so having that opportunity for the students then to, hopefully re-enter into the learning of the classroom is a beneficial thing.
When you have a kid that has to go into this room and do reset, how often are they coming back? Or is that usually take care of the problem one time or 2 times? Or what is your?
We like to say that it would take 1, maybe 2 times. If it doesn't, then there's other things that we have in place. So such as, phone calls home or needing to be picked up early, something like that.
And these are behaviors that we track. Like if it's somebody that is recurring, that is something that we.
Right, that's my point.
Absolutely. It's
How-
something that we
how
track.
often-
We develop behavior plans with students. We use our data map system so that we can do tier 2 interventions. We have our RBTs this year, who are our registered behavior technicians, our OCB, what's the acronym? I'm so sorry.
BCBA.
BCBA, I apologize. So we do have different systems that we have in place. At Montfort Heights, we're setting groups based on number of referrals. So if a student has reached X amount of referrals, then they get put into a behavior group with our ALP teacher or our zones teacher, and they're able to teach them behavior lessons based on keeping the hands to
What's the
themselves.
average on a daily basis that you have to do this with an elementary kid?
I mean, depends on the child, but I mean, you're looking at hopefully no more than once or twice.
How many kids get called or
Get
go there?
in the
per
ALP
day,
room
maybe,
per day?
Right? Is that what you're asking?
You're asking how many support calls we get per day?
Yeah.
or-
Yeah.
That varies.
Yeah.
I would say probably in our smaller buildings, maybe half a dozen to a dozen, and some of our bigger buildings up to maybe 20, if depending on the moon.
Depending on the weather, depending on
Um,
whether it was a shortened week, all of those things.
Absolutely.
Have a huge impact.
Yes, after spring break, after Halloween, like there's always different things, but the supports are nice to have the additional people to kind of have the walkie-talkie to help out.
At the high school level, we have ALP, which is all day for our students, but we also have Red Zone. And that allows, because we recognize that our kids travel to seven different bells a day. So Red Zone allows kind of the same thing like Mr. Whitaker was saying, that if I'm having a bad time in first bell, I might get sent to Red Zone, but then I get a reset at the end of that bell, because how I'm feeling in math class and the struggles I might be feeling then might be different when I go to Intro to Construction. So that looks very different. Our ALP instructor is very good, who also does Red Zone, is very good at tracking. She collects a ton of data, who goes there, why, when the student's sent there, she tracks the reasons why, their names and things like that, and then she'll record things. And then if she sees Matt 2 times, 3 times in one day, it might be a rough day. So then she'll reach out to us so that we can intervene before something might increase.
Does the teacher make that decision to send a kid to the room?
Yes. Sometimes I will say the student will advocate for themselves. The student, I feel like at our level, will recognize that today is not the day. I knew I had to come to school, but today's not a good day. So I think that we've done a really good job since we've started Red Zone to kind of create that space to have that conversation. So I can talk to Mr. Hawes about, I got into it with my mom this morning, and this happened, and I'm just not feeling it right now.
When did you start that?
It was back when Mr. Fisher was
7, 8
principal.
years ago.
Yeah.
And we made changes. And as Aaron was saying, we track it. So if the kid gets sent more than twice in a quarter, they're going to get additional discipline in addition to that.
Do you think that the kids that get sent into there are these kids that you see down the road are having fights in school? At the high school level is what I'm asking. I mean, do you see that? I mean, I was in trouble. I went to the thing, and am I more likely to be one to be
I could say-
suspended, expelled from excessive fighting?
I could say it's possible, but I also believe every kid has a bad day at some point. So I don't think that that's the make or break, that if you're there that is within your future, but.
We use it for minor offenses, so a dress code violation, or maybe, a parent needs to drop off a new change of clothes, that type of stuff. So it doesn't really correlate to that on the kid. Yeah.
Also,
Honestly,
touch to the,
things that we see on our end at the middle school level, students who do that and utilize that strategy and that tool prevent themselves from getting down to the bigger or higher level discipline actions, because they're recognizing their emotional state and where they are, and they're able to advocate for themselves. I have a need that needs to be addressed, and I know it could go here. I want to prevent that need, so providing that space, the opportunity to have the conversation, for the student to be able to regroup, to be able to re-enter the learning environment, has been a huge impact to preventing some of those down the road outcomes that could potentially lead to multiple expulsions or
Do you
suspensions.
see some kids say that just because they want to get out of class?
Yeah, which is why we had to put several layers in there about how we set that expectation, how long the student's in there. To not have it be something they use to avoid work.
Right.
Is,
That's-
or the things that
yeah.
we had to do and kind of set those expectations. So it's a learning process too. Whenever you implement things like this, you are gonna find like, okay, you've outthought me there, but now that I know this, I can do this.
But you also have to ask, why are they trying to avoid work?
Yeah.
There's always, as an administrator or any educator, you're always gonna ask, but why? Like, if they're trying to get out of class to avoid work, but why? Is the relationship not there in the class? Because then we're gonna help as administrator work on that relationship, or we're gonna get in our counselor to let that child open up a little bit more. So there's always a why. It's just trying to figure out what the why is.
And every step of tier 2 isn't just sending the kid out of class. We use data map in our RTI plans to set things in place for our kid to be successful. We know that a student has a hard time sitting down and focusing after lunch. We put in his plans, flex seating. He may need to sit up. He may need a movement break where he gets back and forth down the hallway so we can get him refocused, recalibrate him so he's ready to learn and not cause many disruptions or have to get sit out.
Which is nice to have that process because our kids aren't coming off conveyor belts looking and acting the same, you know? We don't cookie cut them and they come out looking and acting the same. So being able to provide the supports and the wraparound services that we have is a huge benefit for us as we're working on a day-to-day basis with our kids. It's an ever-changing environment with even some of the same kids that you're seeing. Even that behavior changes per day depending upon what happened at home that day. So we have to take into consideration that we are all different. I mean, I have two at my own home that I know are vastly different than one another, you know, and I have to do things different for them. So it's no different in our buildings as we're trying to support them and give them in areas in tier 2 or even tier 3 to provide them the supports that they need. And I think you guys have heard a lot about the things that we're doing, and just to have the document to work in and to have each other as colleagues to play off one another and ask each other questions is great. I know at one of our last administrator meetings that we had, it was really, Jay, you were bringing some stuff up before about some of the things you guys were doing in your buildings, and each of us as administrators got to share some of the neat things that we're doing in our buildings to support staff, to support students. So that's even at another level where we're looking at taking even our tiers, not just for our kids, but for us and for our staff members, how we can continue to support. So it's a nice process that we have to work with one another.
So as you're hearing, PBIS is a huge portion of the work that gets done, much beyond the token economy, but around a systemic approach to behavior change for students and supports. And so you heard a lot around tier 1 supports, one of which you heard directly was around the zone. That's available to everyone, so it's a tier 1 or universal support. We've asked Kristen to come talk a little bit about one of our tier 3 supports, our most significant supports, and that is Transition Academy.
Okay, so there are supports within supports, but Transitions Academy occurs or is available to the buildings at the middle and high school level for those students who have been wrapped around at the tier 1 and tier 2 level, but are still experiencing that externalized behavioral challenge that's distracting the learning environment or preventing the student from experiencing academic success. So when the buildings recognize that we have students that we might need to bring to the table to talk about this tier 3 level, there's a process. So it's not just the student being sent out to this other location. Students in grades 6 to 12 are able to be referred to the program. In terms of what that process looks like, the building starts that process by meeting with the parent and the student. So there's a conversation had within the building itself so that the student and the parent they know what's happening. It's not just being done to them, it's a process that's being done with them to prevent things from continuing to escalate. Building administrators and counselors and support people in the buildings all participate in the completion of that referral process. Before it ever even gets to me, the team sets goals. What are the individual goals that the student has for himself or herself? What goals does the school have for the student? And if applicable, the parent's voice as well. What do they want to see improve, or what additional supports do they feel like would be beneficial for their student to have, to experience that opportunity to reset in a smaller setting with a bit more support. Then the referral comes to me. And then I reach out to the family, and then I meet with them. Fresh slate, I kind of go in. A lot of times there's a little bit of, there's a little bit of bitterness sometimes because they're experiencing challenges. They have a fresh start, so they come in with goals. We're able to work with them and continually meet with them to discuss what those goals look like and what their next steps look like. That's our ultimate goal, is to identify where we're going from here. We're not just outsourcing and sticking. So for a younger student in grades 6 through 9, our goal is to put some of those higher tier supports in place for not just the student, but as often as possible for the student and the family, so that the student is able to transition back into a larger setting and experience increased success at that time. Currently, capacity is around 120 active students, and that's been the trend. Northwest Passage opened in 2010. We've continued to grow and expand. We added 6th grade this year. 68% full right now.
So of those 120 kids that you got in there now, what's the percentage of those kids getting back into the regular classroom? What's the
That has increased as well. And what were we, 20?
About 20.
About 25% from.
So if I'm sent there at the beginning of the year and then January comes around.
Correct.
About 20% of those kids get to go back to the school?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what happens then at the beginning of the next school year? Are
So-
they back in transition, or are they back into their school they came from?
Great question. So part of that goal-setting process, it does not just encompass the behavioral goals for the students, but what is the student's goal for the future? Like, do they want to go back, right? Does the parent want them to go back, or if they're a little bit older, do we just need to support them into the next post-secondary realm? If the goal is for them to go back, then that is what we support. Sometimes we have to retable, though. If a student starts to experience success, we're not necessarily telling them they can't go back. They are able to advocate for themselves or their families
So
do
you're
so and
asking
ask
them,
for
do
more
you want to
time.
go back to Northwest High School or Colerain High School?
We start by evaluating the data in terms of their success relative to their original goals.
Yeah.
Sometimes they'll reestablish different goals. Like, I would like to earn more credits for one more semester to make sure that I'm all the way up before I get there. So we don't necessarily just ask them and give them what they want, if that's what the question was.
Yeah.
If we table.
It's a process. I mean, I would say that one of the biggest things is they set their goals. So their goals kind of help dictate when they come back and when they're able to come back. Because when they're successful and they demonstrate that success, and we know that bringing them back into our learning environment is going to be productive for them, then we do that at any point. We do it at a semester because that would be a logical break to do that. But it could happen at the beginning of the following year. It could happen at the semester. We've seen a lot of success that when they're part of that goal-setting process and they know what they're working towards and what they want to achieve, then their success rate is higher, and that they're one of those students that are able to come back maybe sooner. Some students realize that learning environment and that setting is what is the best environment for them for their learning, and that's where they excel at, and so they continue through that path because they want to be able to be successful and move on to that next stage, whether it's post-secondary school, whether it's a career pathway. So I do think that they have benefits to both, and allowing the student to be a part of that process to see their success and set that goal has been a tremendous point of what happens to where they go after that and when they come back.
And how are the parents with this, if their kids in this transition academy, I mean, are they involved in all the decisions all the time?
Yeah, they're
Can they come back and say, you know what, leave Johnny in this, while he's through high school? Because
That
he has
could
a hard
happen.
time, he has a hard time in a larger
Yes.
setting.
Yes.
Does that happen often?
It can happen, yeah. Are we seeing an increase in that more often than we have been before? Yeah, we are, because kids are recognizing that, hey, this is where I'm most successful and I want to continue with that success. And so the parent and the student both advocate for that. So that sometimes is how they finish out their school.
The kids that are in the transition academy, are they able to do and go to activities at the school they came from? They're allowed to go do all that? and-
There are some restrictions with certain students who might be there for other reasons, but for the majority of the students, they're still able to participate in sports, they're still able to attend any event on school campuses that we offer, families, same thing. So it's still something that they have that access to.
There's a contract on the front end that parents and admin sign off on whether they can or cannot participate. Any student there in lieu of discipline cannot until they reestablish a new contract. So if you're going there as a part of a discipline process itself, you will not be able to participate at an extracurricular until they establish a new contract, and that takes time and process and consistency. But if you're going there because that's the place you need to learn the most, not as a discipline process, but it's just clear, then there's a conversation and a contract that parents also sign off on to say yes or no, would this be a good fit? And they can always reassess that. But then when a student says, I really want to play football, and we go back to that document and it says, sorry, no extracurricular, then we can have that conversation. What would it take for me to earn the privilege to participate in extracurricular, and then the time that it would take to earn that?
So are there two parts to transitions then? One being the students that there's been recognizing that they need to learn somewhere else, and this is where they're gonna go for the foreseeable future. And then another piece is, you've gotten in trouble X number of times, you no longer deserve to have a seat in a normal class setting, and so this is where you need to be.
Yes and yes and yes. So at that level too, at that tier 3 level, yes, there are students who are referred in lieu of additional discipline being added to previous discipline. I would say the majority of the students are coming as a result of a team decision from the buildings to prevent it. We know where we're going if we don't try something else. We've tried all of this, it's just not working. What else can we try? That is more than the in lieu of, but we do have both, and they do exist together. Because sometimes at the building level, you can't prevent that higher, you have to address the higher code and that need. In response, we try to catch it before we have to respond, but.
So I've often heard that it's full, so it's not full, it's only 68%.
So full can mean a lot of different things. We have continued to add middle school spots since the inception of the alternative program in 2010. Started with 5, I don't know if we ever talked about that before. 5 middle school students, we're up to 24 now. And again, I think a lot of that is because we are recognizing as a team that we need to just separate, create healthy boundaries, establish some different coping skills, improve self-esteem on the student, on the student's perspective, and then transition back. We're trying harder to be proactive, so we are serving more younger students than we used to. Nationally, when you look at alternative education, the stereotypical alternative education setting is a dumping ground for kids to sit behind a computer and graduate from high school. Coming in with a license in social work and also administration, we're working really hard as a team to truly address the needs of the whole child, set family engagement as that foundation for setting these kids up for success before we move them out.
I think to your question though, it's not full. We have spots available. Middle school is the tightest spot right now.
Yes.
That's the absolute truth. And so, as you saw on the screen or see on the screen, looking at next year to even increase more at the middle school range, because we need some more.
We recognize that,
Yeah.
yep, we definitely recognize
The
that.
middle school piece is a different conversation with that because of licensure and
Mhm.
trying to make sure that when middle school kids are there, they're in a more self-contained environment than being mixed with juniors and seniors. So the additional staff and the licensure and certification is different at the middle school versus the high school. So it's been a transition to get more seats there, but it's been also about being able to add more staff there because of that licensure piece. So we're continuing to grow that part of the program, but it's the part that's probably the tightest right now.
So is it at the recommendation of the high school administration, after seeing that a student just continues to get in trouble, they don't deserve to be here, then they need to go over and be here? Or how does that, how many times how does it go that you recommend someone?
So it varies by the student and the nature of the behavior. So it's very much a case-by-case situation that we consider, which we do have to bring to a team. And to think about if the student is going to be successful. If they're showing that they're not being successful in the current environment and we're working through the processes and the procedures that we currently have, it's an extra tool, it's an extra layer. But one thing that I think is really important to say about transitions is the goal is that it is transitional, that it's, for many of our students, ninth grade is an adjustment just like a sixth grade is, right? And so getting used to a new building, setting your identity, all of the high school woes that comes with ninth grade pieces, sometimes that might be a part of okay, this behavior is progressing and this is not how we do high school. And so we're gonna kind of work through this process, we're gonna hit a reset. We never stop being in communication with those students, so we make regular visits to TA, and check in with those students. We're trying to encourage them along the way, and same with the families, because the goal is if they are transitioning out because of behaviors, that they're also being able to transition back in. So most of the students, those are the goals, and checking in on them and going to go see them is a part of our admin responsibilities too.
So what happens if a student if they get in trouble and they're supposed to go to transitions for maybe 10 days or whatever?
Great question. So that was my third yes.
Okay.
So we also have RAS. RAS is our restorative alternative setting that exists on the campus of transitions, but is not a transitions placed student. So those students who are there for 10 days or 10 days plus additional days have the option to attend our restorative alternative setting under the supervision of our teachers while they're still working on their courses and classwork for their teachers in their home schools.
So it's optional?
So it's
They
optional.
could just go home for 10 days?
They could just go
Or they
home.
could come in?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
And that's something you work on with the families and obviously the.
Correct. The administration at the home schools provides the information to the parents. They reach out if they have questions, but they show up.
And that's
Thank
a
you.
really great bridge building opportunity for us in the building to say, we have this behavior, it needs to be addressed, it's a breach of our code of conduct, so here are some of the consequences that they are. But at the end of the day, the passion at this center table is around helping the students see their potential before they see it in themselves, and to ensure that their education is continuing. And so we can clearly say to a student, hey, this is a behavior, this is a thing you did, it's not who you are. Here's where an option for you. You can be meeting with the teacher. You can have some regular schedule. We know how unstructured time is in our school day. Imagine what that's like outside of any school. And so it offers some structure to them and some academic support. It works as a liaison between, hey, I need these materials, or how does this work? And those are just places to help students land a little bit softer so that their reentry is not also burdened by academic deficiency.
Do you find that any of these students are people who have been undiagnosed with a learning disability or behavioral disorder up to this point and should actually have been on IEP but was never particularly caught before, or is that not any part of it?
I think that's more of a team decision, certainly not my specialty to make that recommendation, but
Do you have any statistics on that, if any of these kids have just kind of been under the radar and not
I do not.
diagnosed previously?
I can say that in my 7 years at Transitions, even, especially as a licensed social worker, I would not say that I've ever really felt like we've missed the mark in terms of not identifying what should have been assessed or evaluated prior to them coming to me. If they're coming to me, usually on a plan like that, it's existed.
One of the things that I'll address with that, and I know Brad can jump in if he wants, is that a lot of times from a school system, when you think about what you've heard so far about all of the systems that they have in place to monitor students, the most identification we see is at the elementary level, because they catch it early and they go through processes to see, if we put interventions in place, are you responding to the intervention, or is it beyond what we're seeing there? We suspect disability. Sometimes at the middle school, we see that identification happening there. We see less identification at the high school because typically by then, kids have been in systems, whether it be ours or coming from other systems, and they've been able to track data and interventions. So we see more of the identification happening at the elementary into the middle school level.
And I can share specifically like that they are still our students. I mean, like they still belong to us. I like tell them you belong to me. I talk to Kristen about them, but this year specifically, Kristen has worked alongside our school psychologist with her team, and you know we have had situations where they've taken data and work that we've started and have continued like that intervention process wherever the kids are, like kind of in that. I mean, it can be an added piece, like as we're working through those processes with kids and with families. And so,
The other thing that we see is we do see a lot of students who are dealing with a lot of situations that are beyond possibly what they have the emotional and intellectual capacity at that moment to deal with, and which is why our wraparound services have been so important. And so our partnership with Best Point to have individual therapists on our sites where families have access to get that. So a lot of that is about providing some of the wraparound services as well to help fill some of those gaps and build some of those bridges.
I think to frame up, it's what does a kid need? And so when you look at the 3 tiers, what does the kid need and how long do they need it? And ensuring that we're building the supports around them. And that does have both impact on them as well as the community that they're currently in, right? When we're meeting the kid's need, they're gonna be able to thrive in their community that they're in. And if they need to be in a different space, because that's what they need, then that building also will continue to thrive because that needs being met somewhere else. And that's okay too. So Transit Academy serves the individual student purpose, but also the main building purpose as well to ensure everyone has what they need when they need it. And so to shift gears, we just want to talk about, okay, now that we've had a behavior occur, what is kind of the philosophical process that we use and what does it look like? And so I just want to take a moment because around this table and in this room, we have incredible administrators and they really do come at school discipline from a focus on relationships being the key to success. You know, procedures will fix 85% of your issues. That's absolute truth. The other 15% is relationship. And so this team does an incredible job of connecting directly with students to help them, give them what they need so they know their name, stories, strength, and need. But it is not punishment for punishment's sake. School discipline does not come from a place of punishment for punishment's sake. It serves a different purpose. And so philosophically, we come at school discipline or all discipline from 3 angles. Why do we do this? First, one of the earliest goals is to reduce recidivism, to convince this child not to do this again, okay? And so that is success of school discipline. It's the same as home discipline. Why do we ground our children? So that they don't have that same behavior again. That's why we use tools like that along the way. A second piece that's real is a community deterrent. So when we, on the front end, say out loud, hey, you know, behaviors like this have outcomes like this. There are people in the community of school that will be that will be a deterrent for. I will tell you with personal example that at the moment of impact, when all the emotions are there, that community deterrent isn't quite as strong as we'd like it to be holistically because the kid is way up in the feelings of the moment, and so they're not thinking logically. And so to think that if we just use big numbers and that will create community deterrent, it doesn't in society and it doesn't necessarily in school. But the relationship piece does do this work. And then third, very important as well, is that we do advocate for the victim involved from the infraction. There are many infractions within our code that actually don't have a victim. But the ones that do, when we have an outcome from that, we take into mind what was the experience of the victim in this scenario. And so within the range of discipline, it may go upticks because of the outcome for the victim. So that is the philosophical stance towards school discipline. Why do we do this? It isn't because that's what that kid deserves. It isn't because they don't deserve to be here. It's because this is what they need when they need it for as long as they need it. And it certainly is around these 3 concepts. And so when we talk about success around are we seeing things shift, We think that discipline, when it's framed this way, gets us the look that we're going for. And before we move forward, I want to open to the team, any thoughts about what those three things mean to you or other conversations?
I think one of the biggest things to consider here is, within these three categories here, looking at how are we helping the child learn from the behavior, to the mistake that they've made, what are we doing to help correct it, and what are we doing proactively to help prevent it from happening. Oftentimes you'll find that, when discipline has to be issued, it was an impulsive thing that happened in a moment. So trying to help students recognize their own emotional states, so to be able to prevent a situation from happening. Because in our schools, when we deal with certain situations and when certain acts start to happen, take fighting for example, a lot of that happens in a situation in a second that just happened in a moment. It was not something that was planned or something that was intended to happen. And oftentimes those two students recognize, like, I didn't know that that's where that was going. So looking at how to help them and help teach them before an event like that happens. Number two is what we do, because we issue discipline for an outcome, or we issue discipline for a behavior choice that they participated in, to help them understand those boundaries, those limitations, and that there are consequences to their actions. But really looking at how are we protecting them and how are we advocating for them and providing them the tools that they need to learn those pieces to be able to prevent the number two from happening with the negative behaviors and the consequence aspect. So I think there's a whole bunch within those three things that we look at and consider to make sure that we have those reductions in the things that are occurring on a regular basis or throughout the school year.
I would also say that part of reducing recidivism is the relationship that you're building with families through the act of giving discipline. So the stronger our relationships are, if we're seeing a student who's having repeat behaviors that are similar, that can be an indication that the school is doing everything they possibly can, right? We've got a behavior plan, we're doing this, we're doing this, we're doing this. And so really trying to partner with those families to help get them the skills to come alongside the school and be a partner, and not to be I think there's this negative thought, oh, you call home and the family's gonna do this or that. No, usually they're ready to be there with you, right? And so the more we can get aligned as you're working specifically with a student who's having repeat issues, the stronger the outcomes are. So I think that's another huge, as you work on, a student makes a choice, that partnership with home as you're giving the consequence, and connecting to wrap around that kid, not just at school but at home as well, is really, really huge.
I think one of the things about the educational leadership piece that I talked about at the beginning, especially with these three, is teaching that replacement behavior for our students. We may give a consequence, and that is, I make no mistake, we try to hold our students accountable. They know there's limits, they know there's boundaries, they know there's expectations, but teaching them, hey, if you made this choice, this negative behavior, what can we do differently? What's it gonna look like? What's it gonna sound like? And then teaching them that just because you made a mistake, we're gonna welcome you back to class, we're gonna start fresh, but also, I feel like also repairing that relationship that they need to repair with the harm that they've done. So the setting limits and the boundaries and the expectations is a huge piece of that, but the replacement behavior to reduce the recidivism is a huge piece of that as well. And I know Karen talked about teaching school, and we think about teaching as just instruction, math, language arts, but we're really teaching them how to be human beings. We're teaching them right and wrong. We're teaching them things that maybe they don't always get in their home lives, and that does become our job.
Well, and that they have control of their outcomes. So a lot of times when kids are faced with an event that's in front of them, we have all had this where, something's suddenly in front of you, and it really depends on your response on the outcome you get. So teaching kids how to pause and think, what outcome do I want right now, right? Because you have a lot of choices on responses, but it's providing the think bubble for kids. And I think in a time where they're not elevated and escalated, let's talk about what was in front of you and all those different response choices you had. Because I'm pretty sure the outcome you wanted was not have to call dad at work pull them out of a meeting and tell them bad news. I don't think there's any kid that we have at school wants that to happen, right? So it's just slowing them down and thinking through the process, because really behavior is an easy concept if you think about it. And it's all about responses, but it's teaching kids how to slow down and that they have control of those. It's just getting them the strategies and knowing what they can replace it with so that they feel empowered and ready for whatever comes to them, right? And it's what works for one kid does not work for the next, or what works on day 1 will not work on day 4. And I think that's where you kind of play the game of how do you support the student, but then also paying attention to the victims along the way, because that is your responses affect other people, not just the student you hurt, but it also affects your grandma you live with, or your mom, your dad. Like there's a lot of different victims that can play a part, and for kids to understand that those choices affect many people, not just your teachers, not just your dean or your admin. There's a lot of people, and usually the power in that, why that relationship's so important. What really bothers kids is when it affects people they love. So when you can have that partnership and talk about how that makes that parent feel, or you disappointed grandma at home, that's where the power comes in. So it's important to have partnerships so you can bring those conversation pieces in, and you're sitting among the family saying that same thing to that child. That's when it's pretty powerful.
As we're shifting gears towards kind of those outcomes, and those around the table on a daily basis do issue those outcomes. Yes, there's those conversations, there's those connections, but there's also the outcomes as well. Those conversations and connections go alongside with those consequences. Those two things live in the same space in these offices. If those walls could talk, they would tell you those stories around the conversation, but then also the outcome. And there's some rules around that, that the state sets forth, as well as federal rule. And so Aaron's gonna talk us a little bit through that.
It's legal reference break.
It's really, and well, I think just is sort of a backup to this originally, is a reminder that as a political subdivision, which is what we are, as a Board of Education, you can only do that which statute allows you to do, right? You were created to educate the kids within your district. Those kids are obligated, it's compulsory school age, to come to school, right? We file truancy on them, or we have absence intervention teams that we build and then eventually file truancy if kids aren't here. So removing them from school requires us to tell them, A, here's a code of conduct you gotta follow, I'm putting you on notice, you know the rules, everybody signs off on it, and then if you break that, then there's consequences. Statute allows you to set what those consequences are. And I think when you look at the variety of options, you have an array from your power to say, hey, we're gonna do an in-school suspension that will look different within the classrooms and the structures that we have in the building, depending on your 100, 200, I don't imagine 300, 400 level, but I don't set those, right? I'm not a part of those discussions. All the way up through an emergency removal, and your statutory references are there. Emergency removals will typically for that day, the remainder of that day, sometimes can be into the next day, depending on your grade level. Pre-K 3, it can only be that day. And there's certain due process requirements for all of these. Out-of-school suspension for an incident can be up to 10 days. So you have that as a cap. You can't suspend for more than 10 days for one incident. If somebody is suspended for 10 days at the beginning of the school year, they can have another 10-day at the end of the year, based on separate instances. And then an expulsion is up to 80 days based on the Ohio Revised Code, unless it's for a firearm or a knife capable of causing serious bodily injury. Statute says it is automatic out for a year for either of those, unless your Board of Education adopts a policy to ratchet that down and to give you flexibility for why a student has brought a knife on property. And sometimes you get we have some clients who, it's hunting season. I didn't realize when I pulled into the parking lot and I had my hunting rifles in the back of my truck. Well, that would be an automatic year out of school if we didn't have a policy that would allow us to be flexible. Or a Boy Scout came back from camping and the pocket knife is in his book bag and didn't realize it was there and it just fell out in English class and I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to, right? Having that flexibility is allowed if a board adopts it in policy, which you have.
And
There's,
that goes for expulsion, is
Yep.
for what grades does those apply to different grades, right?
so you're really looking at 4th grade and up. There is the ability for certain offenses for pre-K 3 to expel, but they're pretty serious in terms of it would be a crime if committed by an adult, bomb threats, things like that. You can do a 10-day out-of-school suspension for a pre-K 3 kiddo, but those are scenarios when you look at immediate threat to safety, health, welfare of others. And it's not used very often because the department actually pulls a lot of research on that and reports it every year. And you're supposed to be at 0 suspensions for kids of that age right now. I don't know how you predict behaviors and can control them always, but that's what the department would like to report. There is also the option that is, I would say, exceedingly rare in my years of doing this. I have not seen a board do this, but a board can seek permanent exclusion of a kid. That is after a suspension and expulsion has been provided, and that is after there is a criminal conviction, not a charge, but a criminal conviction for certain crimes that are listed in statute, mainly dealing with aggravated murder, rape, aggravated assault, voluntary or involuntary manslaughter type of things. If someone is convicted of that, you can, as a board, apply for a resolution. You can pass a resolution and apply to the director of the Department of Education and Workforce to permanently ban that student from all public schools in the state. It's more than just your district. It's a very big step, which is, I think, why it is such a rarity, but it does exist out there. Those are at least the Ohio statutory basics. There is an overlay for the federal law, and I will tell you, I do a lot of special education law. Putting this in one slide hurts me. So if I can put an asterisk on top of the slide, I would, because there are exceptions a million times over on this for weapons or drugs. But the very fundamental federal overlay basic is that for any student with a disability who is identified through a 504 plan or an IEP, you cannot discipline them for more than 10 days in a school year if that behavior essentially is their disability, right? If it is a manifestation of their disability, what you're looking at disciplining them for, if but for that disability, they wouldn't be there, you can't discipline them for more than 10 days in that school year for that. Does that make sense?
So if a student with a disability at any level fights over and over and over again, you can only give them 10 days?
So you
And
have.
you have to just keep letting them hurt people?
You don't have to keep letting them hurt people. You go through a process. And so in each situation that when we do training for administrators, we start with first you're a student, right? And then you become a student with a disability if you've gone through the evaluation process. It is not saying we allow them to hurt people. It's saying in that instance, when you have a first incident where they fight, right? If I'm a student with a disability and I get 10 days with a rec for expulsion on a fight, once I am near that 10th day, the district IEP team, or 504 team if they're on a 504, is going to call a manifestation meeting. And that's a manifestation determination review meeting, where you go through in detail to determine, here's what this student's disability looks like. Not the Google printout of the disability, but what does this look like for that student? And then we go through in detail what that behavior was. And we determine, is there a direct and substantial relationship between the two? And if there is not, that student is disciplined the same way as any other student. If there is a direct and substantial relationship, under the federal regulations, we are required to return that student to the placement that they left. And then do a functional behavior analysis, which is an evaluation. I think I heard bits and pieces earlier, we were talking, what's the function, the why of the behavior? And then to build a plan to support the student so it doesn't happen again. Now, in a lot of cases when, and I'm not talking only for Northwest, I'm talking broadly with what we do, if a student is at the table again for something like that, we're probably talking about changing services, changing placement for a student within their IEP so that they're receiving more supports somewhere to dig into that why so that it's not going to happen again. Probably not within, it might not be within your buildings, it might be in a different classroom within your buildings that's more designed to help students like that. It's not just saying, hey, free range, go do what you want to do. They're still coming back to that table each and every time. You could have multiple manifestation determination reviews in a year. Each time that student were to do something, we're still disciplining, but you're having a meeting on the other side of it to say, was this a manifestation of their disability or not?
And how do we feel that's going in our district?
Those meetings happen and those conversations every time a student would meet that threshold.
And it gets, or you guys look at it and say that we should they should come back, or maybe we should make this change, and so we follow all
Oftentimes, we
of that.
determine it's not a manifestation. So I would say that happens more often than it does the other way. But if it is a manifestation of their disability, then we look at what supports they have or what additional supports they need and what learning environment is best for them. So it wouldn't necessarily mean that it would be our building. It could be someplace else. It just really depends on the situation, but those are more situational. And then we do have at that meeting those conversations and then what our next step will be so that we're not bringing back somebody who is going to continually have the same issue, but it's part of their disability and we're not supporting them.
I think that also the main part with that is the aftercare. So even if they do go to transitions, there still has to be a plan in place for this particular student. So it's, yes, there is an incident. Yes, maybe they do need to go to transitions, but it's now what? Now what are we going to do to support this kiddo?
Aaron, what's the difference between?
We have a continuum of services in the district, from a traditional setting in a more general ed setting to a classroom setting to alternate settings. So we have a continuum of services, supports, and least restrictive environments that the team actually walks through with the family around what are we seeing, what supports do we need, what accommodations do we need, what modifications. There's a whole process. So there's a team that is specially trained to go through that and really customize that plan for the child when they get to a meeting like that. And there's a lot of options, even within the district, in terms of a continuum of support. Chris, you were going to say something, sorry.
That's all right, Daryl. Aaron, when I first got on the board many years ago, our IEP percentage was 10%, and now it's 17. I suspect that number will continue to go up. But what is the difference between an IEP and a 504 plan?
Sure. So if you look at, I want to be like a visual person. Section 504 is for students with disabilities, so you have a physical or mental impairment that limits one or more major life functions, either substantially or significantly, insert your word here, right? And then because of that, you need accommodations, modifications to access. It's more of an access law, a federal law. So if you have your whole pool of general education students, if you consider this room, 504 eligible kids might be a smaller corner of it, and then those with plans, because you actually need accommodations and modifications for access, are within that subset. IEPs are different in that you have to have one of 13 enumerated categories that the federal regulations, IDEA, have set out and Ohio has implemented. So you have to have one of 13 disability categories. But just because of that disability then, you require specially designed instruction and related services in order to access your education and to make progress in the general education curriculum. So it's not a matter of only needing, and I mean only in quotes, you don't need extended time, small group testing. You need someone to come in and say, hey, you were behind in math. We are going to have a goal set for you in math computation on addition and subtraction, and we are going to have an intervention specialist work with you on focusing however many minutes a week or a month on serving you specially in math to help you as much as we can sort of get on grade level through that specially designed instruction, or through related service, occupational therapists, speech language pathologists, right, PTs, people like that to help support you in those needs.
Is ADHD the number one?
It's not a category in and of itself for IEPs. It would sit under other health impaired, and I don't know in general for the district what your number one category is. That is not any information that I have.
Okay.
I see a
Who's got that information?
We have it. We can look it up.
Huh?
We can get it.
Do either of these require a doctor's note
No.
or visit, or these are just assessed within our district?
They're assessed within your district. Oftentimes for 504s, you'll have a doctor's note. Just think about it, students who are diabetic, right? You get medical care in the nurse's clinic, but you have a physical impairment that affects one or more major life functions, i.e. your immune system, right? Not your immune system, your I'm blanking.
Endocrine system.
Thank you. Lawyer, not doctor, but I knew one of them.
You're doing great.
Insulin. There we go. I was going with the other I word. It's fine. But because of that, you have a 504 that allows you to go out. You're not going to miss class time, or they're not going to penalize you for that, things of that nature. And there's an evaluation process. Under IDEA, you have a different educational evaluation process that the district is required to consider any outside medical evaluations, but you will do your own. So you often have your classroom teachers, your school psychologists, any related service if necessary, all looking at, there's a mandated form for you to go through areas of concern, and then who would do certain evaluations and pull together data for that.
So there's some other due process laws and rules to the process, so I'll let Aaron also walk us through these areas that maybe not everyone knows, that there's certain ways in which we have to operate our investigations or outcomes as well.
Fantastic. And so long I wasn't speaking, and now it's a lot of
You're up.
speaking. So at least in terms of due process, all of your administrators know for giving students discipline, we have to first give them notice of what the rules are. That's your code of conduct. That's why you have it there. And then in terms of any suspension, they have to have an informal hearing in front of an administrator to say, hey, student, here's what we think you did. What say you, right? And we believe what you did could rise to suspension. And then the student signs a piece of paper saying, I was given an opportunity for this informal hearing. And then from there, the building principal says, great, I gave you this opportunity. You signed it, I signed it. You get the piece of paper to take home to mom and dad. Sometimes received from mom and dad, sometimes not, so we email. And then they issue the notice of suspension after that. And that is all the real due process is needed for student discipline. There's a whole investigation piece of it too, but that's what your building administrators are trained to do. For expulsions then, if there is a recommendation for an expulsion, that is written into that suspension letter, and from there, it goes over to your administrative offices, and notices are then sent out for hearing before you're expelled. You have the opportunity to come be heard in front of an expulsion officer, plead your case, expulsion officer then makes a decision. If you don't like it, you can appeal it from there. I believe you all have a designee to hear expulsion hearings as opposed to the board hearing it. And then if we don't like it from there, not we as a board, but as a parent and student, then you can appeal it to Hamilton County Common Pleas Court. So that's more or less those due process. It is, for student discipline, the rules are there, we need to follow them, but they're not incredibly hefty, okay? Now, make sure for, again, my little asterisk for special education students, don't forget your MDRs, manifestation determination reviews. You do have laws governing your search and seizure procedures. That's the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, that you have to be reasonable in the scope of any search that we would do here. So in schools, it's reasonable in scope, justified in inception. So I can't just come up to you and be like, you know what, I feel like searching your bag today. We can't do that. We have to have a reasonable belief that you have something in your bag that we need to search. Like if we believe that you were vaping on the way into school and we could smell THC vape on your way into school, we can have you empty your pockets, we can search your bag. If we find a vape, we can test the contents of the vape. All of that is perfectly justifiable. But those are the main rules about searches and seizures with regard to schools.
And we probably spent some time already on pre-K 3.
Yep.
And then also
We did.
around 504. So I think we're good on that. Do you think different?
No, I don't, unless there's questions.
Any conversation from the team before we move on?
Yeah, you mentioned vaping. What's the discipline on vaping?
We have data on that coming up.
That's what I thought, okay.
Yep. Okay,
Thank you, by the way.
you're welcome.
I know it's a lot. So we did come up with some conversations around current data outcomes, and so what is happening out there, and so we have some pretty high-level, district-wide discipline outcomes that we're gonna talk through, and of course, anyone in the room can jump in all along the way. Couple things that we look at here, some notable data points. So when we look at August to February last year to August of February of this year, so looking at the same, roughly the same time frame minus the leap year, because we didn't have one of those last year, we see some changes here. And so holistically speaking, we see an office referral reduction, 623 less office referrals in the same amount of time district-wide across all of our buildings, all 8,332 students district-wide. We do see some of that reduction. In addition to that, we see a reduction thus far in some occurrences of out-of-school suspension. We've seen 226 less occurrences, which is roughly 15% district-wide in the same amount of time. And so when you think about the outcomes of that RISE acronym, we start looking at why are we seeing some changes? Because we've seen some focus on those RISE pieces that we talked through earlier. In addition to that, we have seen a reduction in occurrences of fights or assaults. We've seen 28 less occurrences, and let me describe occurrences. So every time we use the code, that's an occurrence. So for very common thought, if 2 people are fighting, that's 2 codes. If 3 are involved, that would be 3 codes. It would be strange if it was 1, but nothing's impossible. But anytime that you have a conflict, it would create 2 to 3 or whatever that looks like. And so we've seen some reduction there, district-wide, holistic, across the board. I want to give the team a chance to talk about what they're seeing, referrals, out-of-school suspensions, fights, assaults, or anything before we move on to the last portion.
Do you feel that the teachers, the principals, they're reporting all of the fights that there is?
Absolutely. Yes. No question in my mind.
Yeah.
Yes, no question.
That's
Hey.
immediate.
What's that?
That's immediate. If a fight happens, it's immediate notification to the office. Students are brought down. There is not an opportunity for them not to do that.
Anytime students put their hands on each other, we're contacting parents, we're making sure to have a conversation, and we're intervening.
In addition to that too, like with having the cameras in the school, we're able to pull it up and know exactly what happened. So, I mean, you can't have kids say, no, I didn't do anything.
Yep.
No.
Here's the video.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Team, conversations around those data pieces or others. We'll give you a chance to speak to what's happening and what's the feel of your building.
Go ahead, Aaron.
I was just gonna say, I would echo what Dustin said in regards to the aspects of RISE. We've had a high focus on supervision this year at Colerain High School, so we at our monthly BLT meetings, we look through data and things like that, but in that, we have seen at times upticks, but I do think it's because this year with our strong focus on supervision, within, watching the bathrooms or being throughout the hallways or different areas of our campus, that we're seeing more and we're noticing more and we're taking action more. But I do think that, like the data shows, that it eventually does decrease because students know what the expectation is and that we will be following up on it.
Do you, when kids are changing classes, are the teachers standing in their doorway? Are they out in the hallway? Are they watching?
That is the expectation, yes.
Are they telling kids to move on?
Yep.
Do you feel that helps with the discipline problems and the fighting? And I mean, if kids are going to fight, they're going to fight.
I do. I
just-
also think it helps with the relationship piece. To be greeted at the door when you walk in, I think that is an important piece as well. So I think it's twofold.
And you started doing that this year?
We had a much heavier focus on it this year. That's always been the expectation.
Right.
But we did some other things additional, in regards to the vaping. We have people stationed at the bathrooms to make sure that they're monitoring that closely and things like that.
Gotcha. Okay.
At Colerain Middle, we've had a decrease, but we've always, and I probably don't want to speak for my colleagues, but we always tell teachers, if you have to write referral, write the referral.
Please.
Right.
Yes.
Like we don't want to hide anything. We have to address issues. If we sweep things under the rug, they become bigger issues. So when it comes to that, we do advise our teachers, write the referral, let the administration take it from there, but we don't want to hide anything. But I just want to celebrate the fact that we do have a reduction. That means our focus on the relationships, our focus on supervision, all those pieces of focus on instruction is starting to bear fruit. So, for that, I don't want to, downplay or say that there's some hidden agenda as to why we have a decrease. It's decreased because of the work of the people around the table and our teachers.
So the point that Jim made about the transitions and the teachers being, most of the fights occur during bell transitions, correct?
I don't know if I could say most, but we do have, with Public School Works, what we use, we do have the ability to track location, time, things like that. So it does give us conversation pieces to see, do we need to adjust?
So it could potentially break out in a room in the middle of
Yes,
class?
yes. But even like at Colerain High School, we did adjust our supervision locations based on things that we were seeing in the middle of the year.
And I think it's important for you all to know that, we are accountable to each other. It's an open conversation, really regularly about what's happening with our discipline and what we're doing to respond to it. So I can say specifically at White Oak, you know, you're tracking a lot of data, but that which is measured most changes, like when you're trying to lose weight, right? If you're looking at it a lot, you're paying attention to it, you're testing changes to see if there's any impact. So, you know, first quarter we had a certain number of fights and assaults, we have that. Second quarter it went up. And I mean, you know, Dustin was like, hey, let's talk about it, and we did, you know?
It was nice, I promise.
It was nice. And I was like, got it. Let's do something, you know, so we came up with, and we already had some things in place, because I had already seen some of the same things he saw. And we created some new responses and some new tools and saw a great reduction, you know, in third quarter. Like, proud to say, like, I mean, I'm gonna ruin it, it's one more day, I don't wanna say it out loud. But, you know, it was one fight in all of 8th grade, all third quarter, there's gonna be one tomorrow. So, but it's, that is because of that open dialogue, and because of the accountability, and the relationship inside of the accountability, to be able to be looking at those numbers in real time, and then to also have support in what you're implementing around it. So, that's one thing I can speak of in terms of, like, one of the reasons we have reductions is because we're looking at it regularly.
In quarterly, we report out to student services about, you know, the number of students with referrals, the demographics of the students that are getting the referrals, how many of them have IEPs, how many of them have 504s. We look at our heavy hitters, which ones are getting the most referrals in the building, what type of interventions we're putting in place for them, what teachers have the most referrals in the building, what type of supports we can put in place for them to try to help them throughout the year, because, you know, if they're struggling with classroom management, if they're struggling with instruction, different things that we can help to kind of, you know, throughout the year gradually help them, you know, put those different things in place.
Keeping an eye on things. When you look at, like, at Taylor, one of the things that we use, every Friday we meet as an instruction team, and we have an instructional collaboration team meeting. And a part of that team meeting is our deans of discipline, because instruction, a piece of that sometimes come with behaviors. And so our deans are in that meeting with us, talking about instruction and what is happening in our building, what we're seeing, what teachers that we're seeing that are having upticks, or teachers that are making changes, so that we're able to give feedback, give praise, along those same lines. And so making sure that we have that consistent conversation. You guys were talking about how you're doing it often. I mean, we're doing it weekly, so that we're able to talk about it often amongst us as an administrative team, but also as individuals if needed. You know, you're going to teachers, having conversations around what's happening in their classroom and in the grade levels. Our big buildings have dens, so we're able to kind of see what's happening often in those locations, and being able to talk as a team and support one another. So it's not just something that happens quarterly, as it does, but it's an ongoing conversation how we can continue to improve daily in our buildings.
If I could,
I think the visibility, having 2 deans, having counselors, the administration, the visibility that we focused on this year as well in different parts of the building at different times of the day has been really helpful. At lunch, there's common areas, just our deans have done a fantastic job of being out in the building, being visible. The students see them, the staff see them. So I think that's been a huge help in reducing behaviors in our building as well.
Is there a requirement for how many deans each school that you would have by number of students, or how do we?
Yeah, we have a staffing plan that allocates staff by allocation of per, like, pupil-teacher ratio, and so every school has at least 1 dean.
And then if you have over 400 students, you have 2, or how is that determined?
We have multiple counselors at the buildings, so.
Sorry, I said deans, not.
Yeah, but we have multiple counselors, but they still have the same number of deans. So as we look at that, we look at our staffing plan, try to allocate that. And we do have some buildings where we've added for, looking at the elementaries, the larger ones, because of the need for that immediate response to student behavior. We've added additional ALP personnel, because those are the hands-on people who are going to get kids in crisis and try to manage those. So we've added additional resources to the large buildings because of the need they have with more kids.
Do you think we need, like a school that's got 1 dean, do you think we need another dean at that particular school, or do you think that is gonna be needed?
We continue to look at that. We had extra deans and counselors through our ESSER funds, which are running out this year. So as we've looked at that, we've gone back to our normal staffing plan.
Deans are so important. I think if we have a school that only has one dean, we should look at where can we find that resource to put 2 deans in place. I mean, I see how valuable they are at every school.
Can I offer a piece of impact that I think is important to say too? On any given day, everybody at this table, our admin teams are outnumbered every day. And so that 15% reduction absolutely cannot occur, and I want to celebrate it as well, cannot occur with the people at this center table. We have helped to take a hard look at those operations, hard look at instruction, hard look at expectations and relationships, but our teachers are owning their sphere. And the more that our teachers are owning that sphere and being at their doorway and addressing those behaviors, and worrying about tardies, then we don't have the other behaviors. And so I want to give a shout out to them, and I want them to know that when that's going to snowball as more and more people come on, we can set the policies, or we can, not the policies, but we can set the procedures of, hey, here's what we need. We need folks at these locations. This is what active supervision looks like. But when our staff has really bought in, it's snowballing, and that's where I think is the key to the success, because we're outnumbered every single day.
What school are you at?
Northwest.
So-
The staffing model, is that something that everyone at this table has input into for their building, since they know it best?
Yeah, so we have our staffing plan, which is what we've developed over the years. And then every year, we look at a staffing meeting where we come together, we look at the staffing plan, we look at the additional funds that every building has through title, because that's a different pot of money that helps go above and beyond what a district would do at a normal staffing level. And so that staffing plan is looked at with them at the table every year. We do have to make hard choices based on the resources we have in the district around reallocating those funds. That's how we were able to reallocate funds this year to the large elementaries around additional supports to the ALP. So it is something we continue to look at.
I do think that in order to continue to have celebrations like this, those hard choices around deans, assistant principals, that should be
That should
taken
be
very
priority one.
much priority.
Yeah,
There is-
Very
absolutely.
much
I
so.
mean, a school that only has one dean, I don't care which one it is, give it the name, they need a second one. And we need to come up with a way to get those resources and get another dean in the particular school. You know, at the high schools, how many deans do you have at the high schools? How many is at Colerain?
2 currently. 2 currently?
2? You know, you got 1,800 kids. You know, and I know you got assistant principals and everything, but we need to get the right number of people in there to take care of this. I think it should be a priority.
We'll continue to look at that with the people around this table to prioritize those needs. And I'll get back to you guys with that.
I mean, if you think the deans help out, does everybody think the deans help out in the discipline problems in the schools in that? I mean,
relationship piece.
yeah, exactly. I mean,
It's the
I
extra
think
hand.
it's a no-brainer.
It's the extra hands.
Please?
It's the extra hands. It's a lot of,
Yeah.
it's a lot of real estate to cover on a daily basis.
Yes, it is.
And kudos to our team for some amazing hiring practices as well. They've picked the right people too, right? Our deans are incredible. They're incredible people. They're very gifted at what they do. We're very blessed. Those folks, along with the folks around the circle, do an incredible job. No question about that. But one of the things I've definitely heard over and over around this table is that concept of the RISE acronym, those 4 pieces. And so there's 2 more slides I want to take a look at as first data outcome that I think also reflect those same concepts. So when we look at THC, which is one of the things we talked about, we know that as a society, let's just say it, this is an absolute epidemic across the board. The availability of THC and then also the strength of that product in particular is of epidemic proportions for adults, young adults, and even children. That's a real reality for us in our society. Schools are reflective of society, and so we have seen occurrences of THC within our buildings, unfortunately at younger ages than in previous years because of accessibility, when it's at home and maybe in a drawer because of accessibility. We have seen some of that. But holistically speaking, we have seen a decrease for this year in the same time frame versus last year. And so we've seen 44 less occurrences. That's 38% reduction of THC. And I think that comes right back to that RISE acronym, particularly around structure and expectations, where we have people out and about in lots of places watching these things. One of the questions we get a lot, and I get a lot, is surely we have kids that are coming back and doing it over and over again, and what's the outcome there? And so when you think about the purposes of discipline, recidivism being one of them, we have some data here to show how it's going. Under our current guidelines of outcomes for THC, in the school year 22-23, 40 out of 162 had 2 occurrences within that entire school year of THC.
With the vaping?
Of
With
THC. Of THC vape.
And if I get caught with that, what happens to me?
Yep, so if I can finish the data piece, I'll come right back to you.
Sure.
So in 23-24, thus far this year, we've only had 3 students who have been caught with a THC vape more than once, and none in either of the occurrences more than 2 occurrences. So we have a guideline around first-time drug offense. And so on the front end, a student will receive a 5-day suspension with a recommendation for expulsion. We quickly schedule the hearing. Prior to the hearing, the parents are asked to do 2 things prior to the hearing. One is the student needs to fill out a self-reflection tool. And so they answer roughly 10 questions in paragraph form around what happened, what did you learn, what are the outcomes of vaping, and doing some of that research on their own. In addition to that, the parent is asked to go have a test, for a drug test of the student from a lab setting. And so then they have to produce those results at the hearing. If that is produced, then the outcome is different than if it isn't. If it is not produced, the student gets additional days out of school. If it is produced, they come back on probation after the 5 days. That is for a first-time offense.
Are we allowed to require that, or by law, do you have to only ask for that?
Ask.
And we actually have a pretty high level of participation. So I do these hearings, I'm the one working with the family, and I would say, if you ask me that exact number, I would tell you it's about 88 to 90% of our families do the 2 things, and so that the kids can get back to business. And they come back on probation, and so they come back and know that the eyes are on, and they have to come back to a reentry meeting, which our teams have. And so they sit down with an admin or counselor and talk about what happened, how to avoid, and what do we need to do about it now? How do we get your grades back where they need to be? How to avoid that scenario again?
Dustin, talk about why it's a reflection of what it used to be.
So many, many years ago, when this first started, it was a 10-day on the front and a 10-day on the back if you did not do the 2 things. And so they would have a counseling session, but what had happened was the funding at the Hagomona County level for the counseling was removed. And so they no longer be able to have that counseling. So we replaced the counseling with a set of questions that the kid has to fill out. So, and then I read them and I talk to them about it at the hearing.
Through a partnership with the Department of Health, we used to have access to a drug counselor. So our kids would not only do the testing, but have access to drug counseling services. And so when that went away and we weren't able to access that anymore through different funds that dried up at the county level, we've maintained that reflection piece to kind of have some semblance of a reflection on why it happened and how to reduce that recidivism. So it's one of those things that we continue to look for other funding methods, because obviously the counseling is obviously more effective than a reflection, but that's why we're at a reflection.
So the discipline outcome regarding this reflects the 3 things that we talked about earlier. Victim, advocate for a victim. There isn't necessarily a secondary victim here when a kid is in possession of, not necessarily. Talk about recidivism. I'm showing you numbers that say, is the current guidelines working? Is it functioning to reduce recidivism? And then, of course, community deterrent as well, being you have to be out of school, and then you have to go do these things, and also be on a hearing with your parent and talk about what happened, why did it happen, and all of the things in between. And I do those hearings, and I'm telling you with absolute confidence that conversation at that hearing is very powerful for those students. To have to sit there with their parent and talk about why did they make that choice, how did it come to be, and really own all of that. And they do. That's part of the process in the conversation. We're always going to have an outlier of a student that says, not me, didn't do it, that's not fair. Of course we are. But we're talking about 3% of any kid that did any of this that would be reacting that way. Almost all of them react in such a remorseful way around what occurred, and they're embarrassed. And their parents are also embarrassed. And so there's conversations there that because of the outcomes that we're seeing, right? Our recidivism rates are exactly that's what it looks like district-wide around outcomes around THC and vaping. Table conversation from the team, thoughts on our current process, how it's going, your other thoughts. Feel free.
I'd proudly say we do not have that issue.
I hope so. Yeah.
But it does bring up a different dialogue, which is that if any parent is watching this, to keep in mind wherever your items are, keep them away from your kiddos because they will bring them to school to show off, and et cetera. We are seeing some of that at an elementary level where they are trying to show off to their friends, and that's how they get possession of these things. That does happen, not very often. It is very rare, but it's always a good conversation. Other team members and their thoughts.
So, I'm sorry, you said it's 5 days.
Yes, it's 5 days on the front.
Have we ever thought about increasing that to see if it would make those numbers go down?
So we look at it every year. I look at that data every year. I look at two things, occurrences and recidivism. And I say, okay, do we need to make an adjustment here to say, are we seeing an increase of occurrences? And then are we seeing an increase of recidivism? So over the past, let's use the number 5 because they haven't been around forever, that vaping is really taking off. That is the conversation I have every single time as we think about what do we need to do. Because part of our goal is to have kids in school, right? And so if we can get the same job done with 5 that we can get with 10, it makes sense to do 5 because we get the same job done. If the job's not getting done with 5, then we need to make an adjustment. And so if a kid doesn't do the 2 things, they get 4 more days. So they do get those extra days if they don't participate in the 2 things that we offered. Now, this is around possession. This is not around distribution.
Right.
Distribution is a whole different category and a whole different outcome. This is about purely possession or use of as a part of this process. So if a student has had no other discipline in a year, this would be 5 and then potentially another 4 where they have this kind of outcome. Those aren't always prescribed perfectly because sometimes there's other codes. Sometimes in the process the kid wasn't quite as cooperative with the administrator. Extra codes could mean extra outcomes. But if we're talking about a cooperative student around THC and it's their first time, that's how we stay consistent and we have the outcomes that you see here. So that, in my mind, to be point blank, I think it's working extremely well. But other admins speak up. If you think differently or otherwise, this is a good time to have that dialogue.
Dustin, I thought I heard on the news, and of course, I don't know how accurate their numbers were, but that I know what we're seeing, these are numbers at school. What percentage of high school kids vape? I mean, it might be away from school during the summertime and the evening on the weekends. I heard 40%. Does that seem right?
That's probably a very accurate number.
Yeah.
It's scary.
Yeah.
Because smoking or use of nicotine is not new. We know that. And teenage use of nicotine is not new. What is now happening is that manufacturers and companies are finding ways to hide it. They are not helping us and our community. They're not helping parents. They're helping this to increase, which it's an absolute crime. They really need to be held accountable to this because they found a way to be undetectable. So to your point, when it's undetectable and you're going to see an increase and it's so accessible, and I would speak out loud and say the organizations in our community that are selling to kids and not IDing at the door need to be held in check, and that's real. And I've gone to those. I've gone to the place by Kroger's, walked in the door, shirt and tie and ID, and I put it on the desk and I said, I'm tired of our kids getting removed from school. who's the manager, and can we talk about the fact that you're not IDing anybody? Of course, their response is what? We ID everyone. Not true, because I'm on the hearings and I talk to the kids and I'm like, where did you get it? And they can name the place. And it drives me crazy. But to your point, that's probably a pretty accurate number, and a lot of it is around just accessibility. Sorry, that was a little bit of a soapbox, but I have a lot of feelings about it.
Yeah, well, those shops are everywhere. I mean, Mark testified to us about his encounter with the store near his office, and it was shocking, the stuff that kids can buy.
Yeah, it's amazing. I have two thoughts around this. One, I think as a district, we ought to look at bringing a CDC, chemical dependency counselor in, because this is not gonna go away. This is only gonna grow. And I would much rather get ahead of that. Do you feel like that would be a benefit, Chris?
Oh, yeah. I mean, for, I think the big thing though, Mark, is the accessibility. I
Sure.
mean, they're all over. It just seems, they might call them something else. Sometimes it's vape shop, sometimes it's tobacco, which means vape. But I think in my community, I can think of several, and I mean, Mufford Heights, so, yeah.
If there'd be somebody interested in the district, you can do a CDC class online through the state of Ohio. It's all online.
Sure.
It's 40 hours, to maybe have somebody specialize in that. The other thing is, does Colerain Township have the rapid response team still?
It does exist.
So could we have the rapid response team meet with a kid that has been caught with THC or drugs?
Like I said, it's impossible. Not. The conversations earlier around the Hamilton County change was around capacity and reality of capacity, because these are 30 to 40-minute conversations every time. We had that dialogue. I had that dialogue with Colerain Township. Once I found out the county couldn't do it anymore, I went to the township. They're always so cooperative. They're wonderful. But we had to have a real conversation about what number are we looking at here, and how often could we really do this, and could we do it in time, right? Could we get this conversation going in time? And at that moment, it wasn't possible, but that's not because they weren't willing. It's just a capacity issue.
And we could always look at, because it's such a small number of recidivism, that
Sure.
would really kind of target in some additional resources around that from the recidivism rate that they might be able to have capacity for.
Then are the RSOs trained in any special way about this?
Our SROs?
Yeah.
Obviously, their police training puts them in a
Right.
position to be able to recognize things. They are also being responsive of society changes. And so, they had to make that shift around the prosecution office around whether they could or couldn't prosecute accordingly. And so we've established some thresholds that say if a kid has 3 times in a year, are we all on the same page that we're gonna go ahead with some type of charge, get them to the diversionary court, continue the conversation. But on the front end, there's been some shifts around what's available. Court capacity is real. That's a real thing. When you look at juvenile court and what they can really manage, and the volume of THC society-wide puts them in a tough spot. I have 2 more slides. I have 1 more slide for you, and it's 2 more topics. But before I leave this, anything from the administrative team around THC and our current guidelines? So the 2 last pieces are things that I know that were conversations coming from the board in particular, so I gathered some data. It's not always answering all the questions, but I gathered the data that I could find. So across the board right now, as far as phones, PCDs or personal communication devices, smartwatches, phones, things of that nature, we have seen an increase of occurrences, which is discipline occurrences, up 96 occurrences, 14% district-wide. At our 3 levels, we have consistency rules around the use of PCD or phones and whether they can be in possession or not. And
Those
so
rules did change going out of last year into this year, so that
And-
uptick
yeah.
could be related to the fact that the rules changed as well as.
And the rules do live inside the code of conduct. So at the bottom of the code of conduct lives the PCD rules. We use PCD because a smartwatch isn't necessarily a phone, but we wanted to incorporate that communication device, or if you're walking around with an iPad and you're FaceTiming, it's a personal communication device. We wanted to ensure that we weren't gonna have anyone, circumventing the language. So PCD is why it's there. And then lastly, and I'll open it up again, is dress code infractions. There's some conversations around that. Overall, between the 2 timeframes, we have seen a decrease of in the same timeline, so it's not like, obviously we have spring coming, that's real. But in the same timeline, year to year, we have seen a decrease of district-wide of dress code infractions. So I know the next step is just questions and open dialogue, so I want to open this dialogue to this team around PCD or dress code and just know that it's open space.
Dustin, I'm curious, I've been advocating complete banning of the cell phones from when the kids walk in, they put them in their locker, and when they leave, they can get them. Arguments are if there was some kind of trouble, parents wouldn't be able to get a hold of them. I brought up at a recent board meeting, several countries, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and England, countrywide have banned them. There's a reason for that when whole countries are doing it, in my opinion. You know, the number of, 14% increase there. I don't think anything good comes from them. Teachers will tell me off the record, cheating, texting, their students are distracted by them. I'd be curious what any of the administrators here might have to say about cell phones.
Yeah, open dialogue. That was that next step. Anybody?
Any cell phone issues, Gina?
You know,
I mean, but they do bring them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm surprised at how young the kids
Yeah.
are that bring the cell phones. I have 2 daughters and a 2-year-old, and my 13-year-old has a cell phone, my 11-year-old does not have a cell phone yet. And I'm surprised how many, like Jamel said, second graders will come in,
Oh, yeah.
first graders will come in, and it's, at that age, there's very few things that are theirs, but that's their cell phone. So it's a real power struggle with the kiddos when they have their phone. So you're right, teaching them how to be appropriate digital citizens is important because
Digital citizen,
because it's real.
I mean, some of those kids are going home to no one, and
Absolutely.
they need that
It's-
to make a phone call.
it's
I
true.
mean, there's a very real reason why an elementary
Absolutely,
kid
but
may have one,
there's
too.
also a reality that, like you said, when they come in the building, and
Yeah.
part of the reason I think that we revamped it this summer was because we wanted to try to be consistent across the elementary world, or consistent across the middle school, and consistent across the high school world. But at the elementary world, they're turned off away on their backpack throughout the school day, and then after they get home, or if they get on the bus, then they're able to contact their parent. But we do expect them to have them off and away throughout the school day, so
Yeah.
it's not a distraction.
At the elementary level.
The middle school world is the same thing, high school world is the same thing, like they have different zones that they have the ability to use them, and I'll let Aaron and Allison and Ali kind of speak to that, but like, it's definitely a everyday constant battle with the cell phones.
But I would say that one of the, I don't know if it's newer or just that it's in elementary, it's coming alive, is that the use of the social media outside of school brings
Yes.
issues into school. So it's not always necessarily the phone being in the building. They're there, and yes, we have to remind people how to use them and put them away, and they do cause some trouble. But for us, right now, it is really what happens outside of school that parents and students bring into school and need support in fixing it or addressing it.
What is the, what action do you take at the middle school level if a student is caught with the cell phone?
So we have a progressive level of discipline. First consequence or first infraction is a call home to the parent with a conference about, hey, these are our expectations, this is the rule that applies to cell phones. If it continues, then we go up with our progressive level. The next step would be a 2-hour after-school detention, then ALP. There have been some situations where the parents have requested, like, they need to have it to and from school for those reasons. Can they store it someplace in your office? I give permission. And we've tried to work around those situations because they recognize that it's an issue and they don't want to keep going up in levels of discipline, but they need them for specific reasons that we want to honor and respect. So we've worked situations like that out. So those kind of occurrences have happened where they've gone through all of the levels that we have, and we don't want to have to suspend a child from school just because they keep violating our cell phone policy. So for specific situations, we've worked out some alternatives to that so that we can help support that need. But for the most part, as long as and I think part of the reason why that's increased is we've been so diligent about making sure they're following our policy and enforcing that as throughout every aspect of school, classroom, hallway, cafeteria, which wasn't always necessarily the expectation in the past. So once we shifted that and we collectively came together as a middle school team to develop what that would look like and what our progressive level of discipline would include, we've been enforcing that pretty strictly this year. So I think that now that that's become the expectation, we'll start to see a decrease in those numbers.
I would say for the high school level, kind of what I said before in regards to the increased supervision and things like that, there's been an increase in noticing cell phones. Because the other change that we have made is that during bell time, our hallway is a red zone. We found in the past a lot of kids would go to the bathroom and they'd take their cell phone and they'd be like a cell phone zombie and they'd walk through the halls and do what they needed to. At times even used it to start other issues. So we implemented this year that they have to find each teacher has identified an area in their room where the student has to leave their cell phone in order to get a pass. And we have noticed a dramatic decrease in time students are out of class. What we have now, though, run into is that students are getting very smart and bringing 2 phones, so they leave a burner and take their other one. So it's just those things that we are constantly having to work through and tweak so that we can make sure that we're holding them accountable to our expectations, but adjusting with the times.
I have many burner phones on my desk right now.
Yeah, they're completely addicted. So, I mean, it's definitely something like that as a community and families can really help with working around that. And we're experimenting with a pilot phone home program right now at White Oak Middle School as the 8th grade parents have been able to receive my communications around, because they, like, even if they're a really great human being that doesn't get in trouble otherwise, if it's on them, it's just like they check it. And they really want to listen to their music. And I don't know, it's just like the way that they disconnect and the way they relax, and they're used to having it all. I mean, they go home and probably are on it the entire time. So it's definitely, we're fighting, I mean, a battle it's currently hard to win.
So you don't use lockers, so
We don't
that
have
presents
lockers.
an extra.
They have to carry
It's
them
right
on them,
there
which
all
is
the
why
time.
which
Yeah.
is why we purchased the phone homes, which is a longer. I'll let you know how the pilot goes later, but we just started.
So far, so good.
So far, so good.
We've tested different things out too, because it is a consistent problem, and we do know that having that on their person, it's such a distraction for them from their learning. We no longer allow AirPods anymore because they'll stick those in their ear, put something over their ear like this so you can't see it, and they'll be connected to their phone. So in certain classrooms, we have cell phone caddies. Teachers have even gone out to buy chargers so that they're willing to put them in there, so that in the classroom, that's where they stay and they're housed. And then that classroom, we also have tracked how many students leave their classroom. Huge reduction, because they're leaving the classrooms to use the restroom to go check their cell phone. We recognize that, we know that that's occurring, so trying to figure out ways and solutions to be able to have them have what they need, but in a way that still allows them to get the education that they're there to get, and how can we do that productively together. With that, then providing them, then there might be a 1-minute opportunity to make that quick check, then it goes back off, back stored away, so that they have that little bit of responsibility factor built in, and showing their responsibility on that end and accountability and holding them to that. We've seen a lot of success when it comes to the issues that we've had with cell phones. So those are things that we're just kind of trying out with specific teachers, with specific expectations, so that we can see how it works and how it plays out, so that we can look at a better plan moving forward, because of the need to have them for certain students, not being able to always house them in a locker for multiple different reasons. A lot of kids still don't like to learn a combination lock, so getting them to even do that piece just to put it in there. And with the baggier clothes, we know that they're probably not, and it's not feasible to check every single locker to make sure they're there. So finding ways where we can work together has been a better solution, and we're finding more success with that. So those are things that we continue to kind of look at and figure out, so that we can have that not continue to increase because of what the responsibility and ownership they're taking with how they're being responsible with their phones.
Our last step of the conversation is just.
Is there any other things, because dress
Oh.
code is on there too?
Yep, thank you, sir. Anything about dress code? So our last step is just around questions.
Is really
So
open.
fights, I mean, that was supposed to be a big part of this conversation, and repeat offenses, and do we have information on that?
Yeah, so, do you have your data on the repeat fighting?
Yes. We'll pull this up here. Sorry, the way they copied over, I want to make sure that I'm giving you the right information. I am. So one of the questions you asked around is repeat fighters. I think that was what you referenced, recidivism around fighting. So keeping in mind that we're looking at code usage, right? So the number 7 represents 7 times the fight code was used, not necessarily 7 fights, right? And quick division is probably divided by 2, and that's probably where you're landing. So in 22-23, we saw 77 out of 521 times students that had 2 occurrences of these codes. So 521 students district-wide had a fight code or assault code at some point in the school year. 77 of the 521 of all students district-wide had a second occurrence of that code, either fight or assault. So let me keep that simple. So across 8,300 students, we had 521 of them be involved in a fight to some degree. Of the 521 that had 1, 77 had 2. Out of the 521 students that were involved to any degree in the school year 22-23, 22 had more than 2. District-wide, K all the way through 12. That was the recidivism rate for 22-23. For this current school year, where we are now, as of the end of February, including leap year, we have 353 students that have been involved in any level of fight or assault district-wide, K to 12. Of those 353, we had 35 have 2 of those occurrences district-wide, and we've had 6 that have had more than 2, kindergarten all the way through 12th grade.
And then, just speaking middle school and high school level, if that occurs more than one time, does the discipline, it goes up?
Pretty rapid.
And then how many times before we say, you can't come back here this year? You've consistently caused a problem in our building, and is
So-
that the discipline given, then on top of that, is the discipline given
Sure.
by the school supported or overturned? How often is that done by the AO?
Okay, so the first question you asked around how many and when. So at the middle school level, your first occurrence of fighting or assault or fighting is automatically 5. If it's assault, you're automatically 10 or 10 with the rec, because we do separate that. It's different than a fight is an assault. And so that would be a 10 with the rec at the middle school if you assaulted. If you were a consensual fighter, your first one is 5, your second one is 10, and your third, if there's a third, is automatically a rec. What we've actually seen happen is any of the second time occurrences have some after effect as well. So if you don't stop fighting when an adult intervenes to any degree, you actually go up a level automatically. So yes, it may be your first time and it may be just a simple consensual fight, but yet you didn't stop when the adult said stop, you automatically go up to at least 10, if not 10 with the rec. So those extra asterisks matter at the middle school level and the high school level as well. So things quickly go up. But to your direct question, 5, 10, 10 with the rec. If there's a rec regarding a fight, the conversation is always around placement. What do we need to do? What does their schedule look like? What happens next? And so we always have that conversation. Do kids come back from a third time after having 30 or 40 days of expulsion? Yes, it is possible for second semester a kid could return to a middle school setting. At the high school level, your first fight is 10, and then any other fight in that year or assault, automatically 10 with the rec. Any assaults at all are always 10 with the rec. And then the conversation is always around what does it look like to return, if at all, along the way, and what does this kid need? But you asked a different question after that, but I want to pause and let that filter the room and allow dialogue.
Pretty consistent how we are. If it's a fight, also with our SRO, if there are fights, they also get a disorderly conduct charge from the SRO where they have to go to diversionary court.
I'm ready to shift to your other question if the room is.
Do we feel like most kids learn after one fight? And that's, or that it seems to be these kids coming back for more right when they get back? I mean, I would think possibly the kids that are fighting are also getting in trouble in other areas of school. So does that play a factor
Oh,
in the
absolutely.
discipline that's?
And I don't know if it's necessarily true that they're getting in trouble in other areas. It could have been something that happened in the
Sure,
neighborhood.
yeah. Not to
And-
generalize
yeah,
it, but
and-
there possibly could be
Mhm.
some of those kids.
So if we do have a first-time fighter that also has a bit of a significant discipline concern, we use repeat codes around that. So in addition to the fight code, we add on a repeat code around repeat 300 level, repeat 400 level, or repeat 200 level, or 100 level, depending. And that tells the story, right? Codes tell the story. And so when we are at the table, or when the decision is made around consequence, that plays right into it, because when that code is used, the story isn't just you had a first-time fight. It is, yet here we are again at a significant discipline issue. This one is fighting, but the story's also, we've had other issues along the way. Therefore, we're gonna go up a step or 2 steps to have those direct conversations around either going with 10 or 10 with the rec, and then, of course, the outcome of the rec on the backside.
It's in the code of conduct that the administrators have the ability to skip levels based on the context of what's going on. So although we have some guidelines we follow, they have a lot of leeway individually when there's context with something that's bigger than that to go farther than that. So obviously, for them, anything farther than that is a recommendation for expulsion. But they have that ability within their buildings.
Two other things that I would add at Colerain, I can speak for Colerain, any student that is involved in a fight does get a ban letter. We feel that additional things like that are privileged, so you do get a ban letter, so you cannot attend some extracurricular activities. That is a piece of it. Then the other thing in regards to any suspension for 5 or more days, upon return, we do have an intervention counselor that students do meet with, so that we can try and work through intervention strategies for repeat offenses, to support the student in other aspects.
Does that ban only during the time that you're not allowed on, or that you're suspended, or do you?
No, that's already, once you're suspended, you cannot go on any Northwest Local School District property during that time period. Our ban is typically for a calendar year.
Great, okay.
So if they fight now, they can't go to homecoming next year, that type of stuff. Just to add to that too, just to elaborate on what Aaron said, a lot of times when these students fight, there's stuff that happens over social media, they still want to fight again. So as soon as they come back into the building, as Aaron said, we meet with those specific students. A lot of times we'll call home, get the students together, try to mediate before another instance does occur in the school. So that's a big piece to it.
Yeah.
In building relationships, students will share things with you, their concerns. And so we also have a progression where we ask our students to maybe meet with their counselors first, offer some mediation if they're struggling with another individual. Then it can move over to an administrative office where we have more of a disciplinary piece, loop in the parents. Parents have been invited in with both parties that are in conflict to have mediation. We also have some no-contact letters that we work through as well, so that the students can agree to disagree and not continue to pester one another. And so those are some of the layers that we try to put in on the proactive side. And I will say that from my experience of kids sitting at the other side of the table after an incident, one of the first things that they do is they often hang their head and know that they had people in the building to support them before it got there. And that's the goal, and I think that helps to reduce some of the recidivism as well.
So you asked another question, which was on changing of discipline, and so as that conversation unfolded, I began to think about like, what are we asking, right? And
So I'm asking that if a administrator says, you know, this student has done this, they've done this, now we're at the point where they need to be expelled, what is the process then? Is that taken at their word that because they know the students, they're the experts? Or is it then go through a process at central office and say, well, you know, we're gonna do this instead?
Okay.
Or how does that work?
So expulsion results in particular, is that what you're saying?
Any discipline.
Okay, so in my 7 years of doing this job, I've yet to tell an administrator to reduce any discipline that they've issued. We've had conversations about increase, where we had to talk about, like, listen, historically speaking, and because it's pretty significant, we need to reconnect with that family and talk about the fact that, yes, we need to go up a step. Example, maybe there was a 10-day suspension, but we really need to have that recommendation hearing. We need to have that conversation that give a chance for the superintendent to go beyond the 10. And so we have those conversations all the time. They call, my principals call very often, and we talk about that. And I would open the dialogue around the room in just a moment around experiences otherwise, but there isn't time that we reduce. We talk about, what do you think, right? So Dustin, I got this thing. What do you think? And so we start, okay, so here's what we've done in the past, and then what do you think? And so we land, right? We land. So that's what that looks like on a daily basis around scenarios that don't get fit perfectly into our consistency document, but rather kind of sit oddly outside of it. There's circumstances, there's this, and so they do call to look for that guidance and that conversation, and the conversation ends with, well, what do you think we should do? If it's firm, then it is. I'll say, listen, I'm sorry, the only thing we can do here is 10 with the rec. We don't want to have any other options. And that's typically, they're calling because they're like, is there any way we can talk through, because the scenario calls for something less, and then sometimes it's okay, but oftentimes it's, I'm sorry, this is where we are. But at the table, we'll have the dialogue.
But
So,
Dustin, at least on part of that, for an out-of-school suspension, it's already given by the building. The only way that is then changed is if the parent appeals that decision
to reduce it.
to reduce that decision. And so that's the only way to do that for an out-of-school suspension. For an expulsion, you have your hearing, and at the hearing, you take the recommendation from the staff member, right? We hear the side, we hear the student and the parent side. Staff, do you still stick by your recommendation for an expulsion? Yes, and then an expulsion decision is made. But it's not, to my knowledge, then against what an administrator would say that they would recommend. Now, that can be appealed, and in that appeal process, someone could not overturn the expulsion, most likely reduce it in some way, but that's through the appeal process you have in policy.
So there's always a conversation after hearing with the administrator. What are you guys looking for? And so the building gives me some dialogue. Here's what we're thinking. And so then we meet and we talk about, what did the building say? Done this work 7 years. And I can tell you there is almost 0 times in which we didn't go directly with what the building's asking for. And if it's not, it's because we went bigger. It's pretty rare when we go smaller. If we go smaller, it's because we have something in the conversation. There's a coding issue. It doesn't match up. There's something that doesn't fit, but I couldn't name a time. I'm not saying it's never happened, but I couldn't name a time. And I have these conversations every single day. There are times that we go bigger, because historically speaking, we've gone bigger before, and so we've set a precedent and said, this is where we've landed before. So a building may feel like, oh gosh, I was only asking for 5 additional, but the kid got 10 or 15. It's because the significance of the issue, but also the precedent that's been set across the year already. And so that does happen, if that does happen, but reductions, they don't happen.
Now, they do have, as Aaron mentioned, parents have appeal processes at the suspension level and the expulsion level, and that goes through a separate process where there could be the person who is the hearing officer for the appeal could look at it and say, from a due process or a standpoint of a code, we're going to look at that differently, but that's not coming from us, that's coming through an appeal process.
I have to say, I'm a little confused, because to listen here, it sounds like everything is sunshine and lollipops and everything's going the right direction. But to hear from parents, from teachers, and from staff at the schools, that's not the case. And to hear people in the community talk, that's not the case. So where is the disconnect?
I think honestly, the disconnect comes from not knowing. They might get a snippet of something that's happening, and then that kind of just trickles out into the community that that's what's happening all over the place, when the reality is that was one incident and one time and one moment. I think from a teacher perspective, the needs of our students are greater than they probably have been. You know, and I have a more veteran staff, and so their years of doing this job and being in education, they've seen a significant change in student needs. There's a lot of more mental health issues going on with our students that we deal with now because of things that they're exposed to. Cell phones, what cell phones bring, the access to students have to one another to kind of consistently say and do things to one another that could be hurtful or harmful. That's across any school. We are dealing with situations that we've never had to before in perspective of what the trauma that the child's coming to us with. And those are situations that 5-10 years ago we didn't experience to the level that we do now. Are we constantly reflecting on our practices and looking at how can we intervene, what interventions are out there, what supports do we need? It's why we, as middle school principals, we get together on a regular basis to talk about, what are you doing over there? Have you seen an impact? Is it something we can incorporate here? So it's an ongoing thing that we're consistently looking at and taking into consideration and looking at how can we provide our supports differently. At times, I feel with any profession, it can feel overwhelming. There's a lot that we do as teachers. There's a lot that we do as administrators. I know for me, specifically, I'm at work oftentimes till 6, 7 at night. And I come in when it's dark and I leave when it's dark. It's what the job requires. It's a lot, I'm not gonna lie. And I know that our teachers are feeling that it's a lot too. But we're trying to figure out how and what to balance and what interventions we can put and build and be reflective of our practices so that we can look at things. It's part of the reason why we looked at our operations. How are we dismissing kids? Are there ways that we can do that differently to reduce the amount of occurrences that are happening that we see when we look at our data? We're taking a more targeted focus on our data. What does it tell us? Because it does tell us a story of what we need to do. It also tells us a story of what we are doing that's working. But I think that's something that is consistently happening, not just within our district, but elsewhere too. We're looking at higher needs and higher things that we have to address at a volume that's higher than it's been before. But not that there's a lack of consequences or discipline being issued. It's just the consistency of being able to do it at the level that we're now experiencing it, but not just necessarily behavior. It's the mental and emotional needs of our students that we have to try to figure out a way to help support them, help teach them. And oftentimes they have families too that have their own trauma and their own experiences that make it a struggle, and their own life events that are occurring on a regular basis. So it's a lot different than the landscape of education looks a lot different than it did before. So I think as we grow and we develop and we look at what our needs are and we have those conversations, I think we're just going to get better and stronger. It's always going to be a work in progress, and I think being reflective of what we're currently doing and how we can make that better is always going to be at the forefront of what we do and a focus of what we want to pay attention to.
Yeah, there are some studies that suggest that social emotional learning has increased the mental health problems among students
What do you mean by
and
that?
suicide risk among students. So, that's part of Northwest program is social emotional learning.
That
Do you-
social emotional teaching of that is increased there?
That some of this awareness of all of this has caused some increased mental health issues.
Oh, I've not seen that research. That would, from my experience in working with students, that's not been my experience. Helping them with those coping strategies, finding ways to help them advocate for themselves, help them identify what that need is, has been a huge benefit to reducing some of the outbursts that we've seen before, because that they now recognize their emotional state and helps them be able to say, I recognize this is where now, knowing this about myself and being able to use these strategies and tools you've now provided me, I'm able to handle this in this way that doesn't result in a school behavior discipline. So it's actually been very productive with helping support the child and being able to give them the tools and the resources they need and the strategies to be able to apply that, to be able to effectively have a conversation with a peer that would have once resulted in a fight, now results in a conversation, because that's a learning tool that they have, and being able to teach them that has been hugely valuable.
Are there any teachers here to give testimonial as to how they feel restorative practices are working in their classrooms, and if they're taking away from any academic learning time, because I've also seen some studies that suggest restorative to practices take away some of the classroom time for teaching, and that some of the academics have fallen since restorative learning has started.
So
or restorative
I can
practices
speak
have
about
started.
preschool, those are our standards. So when you say learning, those are exactly what we should be teaching. So if you look up early childhood developmental standards for age 3 to 4, social emotional is embedded within that.
Yeah, those
So-
are young kids, but by the time you're getting into elementary school and middle school and high school, where's the parents' responsibility for this, and why are we taking this on as a school system that we have to teach things that parents should be teaching and religious societies should be teaching their kids? Why are we making this almost a subject in school rather than concentrating on math, social studies, science, language arts, which is what school is supposed to teach?
So
Are we
they-
trying to become a social work situation?
Oh, well, honestly, I feel like our job as educators is to educate the whole child. That's more than just
But is
language
everybody
arts.
equipped to do that?
Yeah.
People don't all have psychology degrees.
You don't need psychology degrees to be able to teach that. We're
Well, I
educators.
know we got a psychologist here. Do you think people framing people's minds need to have some psychology training?
But they're your standards. We have those all the way up to
Yeah.
social emotional.
You mentioned like the religious component. When I went to Montfort Heights Elementary School, every kid in the class went to Sunday school. Of course, this is a long time ago. That's also the time when my dad was convinced that the Beatles were a communist plot. When you look at culture today in the music, I think my dad would, if he were still around, he wouldn't even know how to respond. I bet you in that in a class of 25 kids, I bet you there's not 3 that go to Sunday school.
Well, I
And
don't know what that really doesn't have anything to do with
Well,
what
but
we're
she
talking
mentioned
about
it,
here.
Nicole.
I know, I'm saying.
And I'm just saying
I
that
think home
kids,
training's part of it. You can't do
Yeah.
everything at school. You have to have home training.
you gotta have
And
the.
school can't replace home training.
And another thing, when, you know, back, maybe I'm living way in the past, but we'd have maybe one kid new leave or come every year in the class. Now, I don't know what the numbers are, but I hear sometimes a kid will move 2-3 times in a year. So its culture has just changed and declined for whatever reason, so greatly in the last. I have a friend who retired from Montfort Heights Elementary as a teacher. She put in 35 years in this district. And she said the problems, in her opinion, and what egged her on to retire, was the cell phones. When those were introduced, that's when she saw the real decline in behavior. And I have patients. I work in psychiatry. I have patients that are addicted to these things. One girl who says she spends 12 hours a day on the cell phone. And she's a college-educated young woman. She can't control it. It's, I find myself, you know, checking the news or scores, you know, so it's just a cultural thing.
So I will say that one of the things, just to kind of frame social emotional from a school perspective, because it is part of the state framework around the whole child framework from the
And I don't think
Department of
it's
Education.
required, right? It's recommended,
But-
but not required.
But part of what we use as social emotional is around preparing students to learn. So it's around how do you maintain positive, healthy relationships? How do you resolve conflict? How do you manage emotion? So we're trying to address the needs that we see in the students around behavior management strategies from that social emotional lens without, that really that constitute that learning environment. What do you need in order to be successful in the learning environment? How to take turns, how to ask appropriately, how to do these things that are necessary for the academic environment. So that's the social emotional envelope we kind of live within, not necessarily some of the personal beliefs and other things like that. That's definitely a family home perspective. It's more about the skills and the soft skills you need in order to be not just a student now, but a citizen and employee later.
But are there any teachers here to give their perspective? Because while these people are all administrators and you do a great job, the teachers are the one who are on the ground in the classrooms every day dealing with these kids and implementing these things. Do we
So
have
look
teachers
around.
here
We have-
to give their opinion?
We have 2 teachers in the room. We have Melissa Nelson, and Dave Fry, I think, are the only two teachers that are in the room at this point.
Because I specifically know a teacher who told me that the discipline's horrible and this isn't working. He's been with the district for a long time. So that's why I question it, because everything sounds beautiful here, but that's not the perspective that you hear out in the community. And somewhere there's a disconnect, and either we're not communicating well, or there's something going on that we're not aware of and we're not discussing here.
I think it goes back to what Allison said around the needs are greater. So what our staff are dealing with on a daily basis are greater. We have more supports now than we ever have. And do we have every support needed for every situation all the time? There's still things that are happening in buildings that are exhausting. And we still have needs as a society and as a school that, you know, they're dealing with on a daily basis. So it is, but I think one of the things that we're hearing is this narrative around our schools that I think gets propagated from social media because people take one incident and they overgeneralize it. And so our buildings, I think if you ask, and I'm not going to speak for anyone in this room, but I believe our buildings are safe, conductive learning environments. Do we have things that we're dealing with on a daily basis? Absolutely. Do we have students with needs on a daily basis? Absolutely. Are our teachers dealing with things coming out of a pandemic and a society that's different than it was 5-10 years ago? Absolutely. And so I think those are the things that we continue to try to every year collaborate, talk about how do we address that moving forward. That's an ongoing conversation. I don't know that it is, I mean, I'd love to talk to the person who said that it's that bad, because we'd love to be able to, like you said, the buildings are talking to their teachers on a daily basis. If they feel it's that bad, what additional support do you need? So I think they have a good pulse on their buildings. They know what's going on, and they're the front line of that conversation. And I would hope that any staff member in this district who feels like they're struggling has that administrative presence in their building and a relationship with the people sitting around this table to reach out and say, I need help.
I'd just like to add also, Northwest High School, I'm rounding numbers here. Say we have about 850 kids in our building. 830 of them are coming to school every day doing it right, okay? So it's those outliers the number that's not doing it right, they're the outliers. Fighting, that's the outlier. That's not a norm in our schools. That other 830 kids don't want that in their school. So they're doing it the night way. They're being the example. They're letting us know where we need to head things off. They're going into the classrooms and they're advocating for themselves, but they're also holding their classmates accountable for behaviors. So 830 of them come to school every day doing it right.
And I was gonna, you talked about the communication disconnect. I think one of the very common things I run into is when we discipline students, the families always wanna know what happened to the other kid. Well, did you do that to the other kid? And our response is always, I can't share with you what I did to this other student. And I really do believe that message, well, they didn't do anything to that other kid, because they didn't get the information. But we're not allowed to give that information. And so I think some of that disconnect comes from we're talking about cell phones. Everybody has access to everything. They think they should know everything, but they can't. And that's uncomfortable, and they don't like it.
And I think that it's important too that we consider that not everyone has an administrative disciplinary background. Even our teachers, if they are coming to work to teach our students, they may have feelings, parents may have feelings about what they think should happen, but legally, we had a conversation tonight where we re-clarified what the law says we can do. We cannot just say, this student cannot return to school. And I get the impression, glancing at social media when I do, because it's poisonous, that's what the desired outcome is. Remove the children. We can't do that. But that's not their job to understand. Their job is to show up to work to teach. So sometimes I think maybe just taking the time to have the conversation about what we are legally able to do is important as well.
And it can't happen overnight.
Correct.
your due diligence in supporting students at every level.
And I will say, to cycle back to kind of close up, the part of this conversation that Nicole brought up, she stepped out of the room with regards to the recidivism and the repeat offenders. Tagging back to what we talked about at the very beginning of the conversation, as an administrator who does assign discipline, having the autonomy and the ability to connect back to the code that we now have that we didn't have before, that Matt brought up regarding students who do have those days held in abeyance. They've been in trouble before, they've been to the table before, and they have these days held in abeyance. Well, now we have a code as an administrator that we can utilize from our own perspective to acknowledge that that is an occurrence, is empowering.
I also think it's important to think about like circle of control and circle of care. So like, of course we care deeply about what's happening to them when they're outside of our buildings. There's cases where we wish something different was happening. I think I spoke about that relationship piece with building relationships with families, because it's only in relationships that anything changes. You know, like when you care about someone, when you trust someone, when you understand each other, when you're looking at things from their perspective, and that is part of our work. But you know what, the kids show up to us the way they show up, you know, and so it is our responsibility to take them, they're 11, 12, 13, even if they're 18 years old in high school, they're still a child. We have to take them where they are and do everything to help empower them, right, to control their own circumstances. While also, of course, building those relationships and trying to, knowing that that does help, of course, right, if we can all get on the same page. That's where real progress can happen. But also, that's the beautiful thing about kids is they can choose their own outcomes. And that comes when we teach them, right? We teach them those other opportunities, which can come through those social emotional learning opportunities. That comes through the power of a restorative circle. When you come back from a fight, you know what? You're gonna sit down with the other kid. Because you know what? Sometimes you do bad things, and we do bad things to each other. We can talk about it, and we can move on. We can establish these new boundaries. And you know what? A month from now, we might be friends. I think we can only control what is inside of our space, and that's a long journey. And it is not sunshine and roses. It is hard work, and it is reflective work, and there is failure. And I think it's just an ongoing commitment to again try to focus on that which we can control. To be honest, with ourselves when we look at our data about what it's telling us, continuing to be more and more open to receiving and communicating with staff, because if our staff aren't feeling well and supported, that snowballs and impacts what's happening inside of their spaces. So I know we've done a lot of work, we didn't talk about any of that tonight, but a lot of work around supporting those staff members, and increasing supports for staff members so they can feel really good. But the last thing I'll just say is appearance is reality, and I think we're all in this space. I know I'm new to the district, but I love it. I think it's an amazing place to work. I would send my kids to these schools, and I just think we get to control that narrative together, and all of us get to see the exceptional things that are happening. The life-changing things that are happening when you have a first-time high school graduate, a first-time college entrant with a full ride. We have so many beautiful stories to be told, and not to say that we can't talk about. Of course, there's fights, there's bad things, there's drugs. Yes, all of that is happening. We have to talk about that. But what about all the other stuff, And so I just hope we can continue as a community to help highlight those things, so that our community can know what we really are. And what we really are is, a group of, I think if anybody was listening, I think they would kind of have an idea. But if you really met our kids, if you came to the choir concert last night, then you'd know our kids. If you came and saw the work that's happening at Butler Tech and interacted with those children, then you'd know, what our kids are and who they are. So I just I just felt I wanted to advocate for, yes, that is currently what's happening. That is the conversation that's happening, not just for our school, but I just feel public schools right now, it's popular to talk about all those things and what's negative. And those negative things do exist. They are real. All of those things are real and they exist, but there's a whole other story. And I
It's
think.
unfortunate those are the ones that get targeted the most. All of the wonderful things that happen within this week, you know, I haven't seen once on the news, unfortunately, but those things happened, and they were positive, and they were great, and they were wonderful experiences, and it would be really good if those were the things that got talked about, and that was the narrative people shared rather than just the negative.
I think the one thing, to go back to what you said about the staff, that there sometimes can be a disconnect, and I would invite the administrators to talk about this, because when a staff member writes a referral about what might have happened in their room or what they witnessed, it goes to an administrator who then does an investigation and issues consequences on the backside. And the consequences on the backside may not be what that staff member thought should have happened, but they weren't part of that process to know the outcome and all of the details and the context around that. So I think sometimes what I've heard from staff members who are frustrated is the fact that they saw the beginning of something and then they saw the end of it and they didn't know the middle and they felt like there was a disconnect. And I would invite other people to, because that's a common conversation I think I've heard.
It's one of the things too that we talk about as a staff. I have an open door policy, so they can come in anytime to share, like, hey, so-and-so got this consequence. Can you help me understand why? And a lot of times when they see the explanation behind it through the investigation that we conducted and the due process that child deserves they have a better understanding to why. Sometimes they just don't know the legality part of it, like just because, and what we have the opportunity to do is we could take the emotion piece out of it, because the teacher in that moment, they're feeling all the emotions of what just transpired. So in their mind, right then, in that moment, I want the book thrown at them, and they should have this consequence. But that's not, when you look at our progressive level of discipline and the actual action the student did, and you do the investigation, we have to give the appropriate discipline for that. So that doesn't always align, not that it's the wrong discipline, it just doesn't always match what the teacher thought should happen. But oftentimes, a conversation with them to explain all of those pieces so they can see that, because most often they didn't get the administrative degree that we have that requires us to do more education around how we issue discipline, consequence received, that progressive level, what does it look like. So being able to have that open dialogue with them for the staff that come in and inquire about that has been very impactful with their understanding of how things have shifted or how things have been issued as far as consequence. Also, we get new teachers in our schools, and they come from maybe a parochial background or a charter school. They have different ways to discipline. With being a public educator or public entity, we have certain things that we have to abide by that doesn't always have to be a practice in a parochial school or in a charter school. So it is different, and so there is a learning curve that comes with it. You know, we can't just remove a child because we think they're acting up and we want to call a parent. Then we're not providing them their free public education that they are legally required to receive. So we have to pay attention to all of those things, and sometimes it's the education behind it for the teacher as well to understand it, and also for the parent too. You know, these are our practices, these are what's required, and this is the process that we use, and that's why we have those code of conducts in place and that progressive level to kind of show this is what we do for these situations. So I think that that's a huge piece that, as Daryl mentioned, that the more opportunities we have to help teachers with that and that understanding, it then develops a better relationship with their reasonings to why and morale itself. But, you know, at the end of the day, we're dealing with a lot of just things that we have to do just all over the place, not just with behaviors, but, you know, academically, wanting to see our students achieve at higher levels, filling in gaps because of the pandemic and the learning that didn't happen for a certain amount of time and months that occurred through that. You know, we're doing a lot more work than we did prior to that because of what we're trying to catch up with. So I think that's just a lot of what we encounter on a regular basis that we have and we're experiencing.
I'd like to add on the flip side of that, the number of teachers and staff that will advocate to the nth degree for not only our students, but your students as well as being a part of this school board, that I'm extremely proud of. There's been times in my building that I've gone and I've said, okay, here's kind of what's going on. Here's kind of the plan. Oh, no, I want them here. You know, we can count on many hands across this forum in here how many teachers have calming areas in their classrooms, how many strategies that they are willing to use and willing to try to help these kids. And a huge shout out goes to these folks. It is an absolute team effort. And the amount of times that I've had conversations with staff that that were not on the same page with me as far as like, I want to really push the envelope with discipline, and they're like, no, they just need to take a little reset. I got them. I'll get them where they need to be. And they want them back right away. Like, okay, let's just talk about this for a little bit longer. Let me take them for a little while longer. So we have those kinds of conversations happening as well in our schools. And
What's a calming area in the classroom?
it's an area like in the back part of the room where students can just go and get a reset without leaving the classroom.
I have a question that is probably gonna come off incredibly insensitive, and I don't mean it to be. Where do you draw a line with this stuff before you say, like, there are things that I personally wouldn't want a teacher teaching my children. I feel like that's me and Tia's responsibility to do that. So where does the line get drawn before you've spent so much time, and I'm not saying children are not worth it, I'm not saying that at all, but where do you draw a line that you put so much effort and energy into, I'm not sure what to call the initiative.
Soft skills.
Yeah, that it takes away from maybe the other kids in the class that, does it take, I guess my question is, does it take away from other kids? Do you see what I'm saying? Where is the balance with all this? Like, because I can see, education, everybody is incredible hard for children, clearly. And like, where do you stop from going too far over a line in public education? Is it making sense the way I'm asking this? Because
I'm hearing you earlier ask for more deans, correct? Like board, across the board, you guys want more deans. Our deans are people that supply support. So it's not just our teachers that we're talking about. Like you have support staff in our schools that also provide education. So I hear the board saying, yeah, we want deans, but these are the same exact people that would be providing this teaching to our students that I also hear the board say, I don't really agree with that. So I'm just telling you honestly, like in listening to you guys and trying to hear this. So I don't know, I'm a human being. The reason I'm an AM and the reason I went into education is because I was a student that required extra. I was a kid that needed more than just the textbook, right? I didn't fit that. So how dare for me, when a kid walks in front of me to say, you know what, like, I'm not gonna give you everything you need because I need to teach math.
And Gina, I understand that, but what if
I
they
don't
take
know where
so
there's
much
a
from
line though.
Gina?
That's what I'm saying, Mark, is I don't know that, I can look at a kid and say, this is the line. I will use the support staff I have in my building, right? Everybody, I will exhaust and I could probably say that for everybody in here, we will exhaust to the nth degree.
Sure, and I'm asking the question, I'm not.
I don't know that
I-
there's a straight answer for that. For me, I don't know that I can't give you an answer for that.
I guess the question is, if you're filling that kid's bucket so full, because you're spending that much time with that kid, are you not filling these other kids' bucket? Because you've spent so much time. But every kid needs their bucket full, no matter
Right,
what
and I
their
would say
needs
that
are.
every kid
Maybe
gets their
different
bucket
things they need in their bucket, but they need their bucket full.
Yeah.
Mark said he's great.
So yeah, just
Yeah.
because my time requires with this
Yeah.
child
I'm sure you would never want us
more.
to draw a line on one of your children.
Yeah. But I mean, for one child, I might be paying more attention and filling their bucket. But this child over here, who's also has their bucket full, may not require as much attention.
At that moment, but
Yeah.
they might a week later.
Right.
Because they have a tragedy that happens
I
and
would
you're
say
there.
that we're not taking away from other students' opportunity by any means by providing that student or a few
Right,
students.
and my question is, how do you ensure that that doesn't happen?
I think by looking at what we're doing, how are we effectively?
And that kind of leads into my next question is, like, I kind of equate this when healthcare went to electronic medical records. And we had a lot of healthcare workers who, they paper documented, and then now they got to learn this computer system. One place I worked at, 60% of the nurses quit because they didn't want to go to electronic medical records. 60%. And that was a huge change in the healthcare environment. And so I know we have a lot of veteran teachers that this process is very different than education when I went to school. Like, it is, you guys are speaking a completely different language. Some of it I understand because I've worked in behavioral health. So, you know, I'm picking up on bits and pieces of it. But how are the teachers doing with, we've got an app that they have to document on, and we have all these other things. How do you ensure that there's not teacher fatigue through all of this? Like, how do you give them the B12 in the arm to keep them motivated? And like, I could think, you know, my daughter's going in education, and some of this complexity, I'm like, are you sure? Because this is incredibly complicated. Like, it is incredibly complicated. But, you know,
I don't think there's a simple solution to the complicated problem, right?
exactly.
Yeah, and I hear what you're saying. It is overwhelming, and Allison spoke to the volume in which we're experiencing right now. Mark, I mean, you're right. In your profession, you had people drop off because of the change, and we're seeing that, you know, as a whole in this profession. We're seeing it.
Yeah.
We're living it. Spent 2 days out of my last, 10 days at work at Miami and University of Dayton. And the smallest classes, things are happening, like people aren't entering the field. So how do you give that B12 shot? We're built different, man. Built different. Like there's a passion in it. I can't quantify it for you. I can't put a number to it, but we're built different. And if you can handle it, it's a tough profession. It's difficult. It's a grind. Not to take away from any of the other work that's being done in this world. But this is a grind. This is a passion. This is a calling. We're not in it for the money. We're not in it for anything other than these kids and this community. So.
And Brad, I'll back
Yeah.
you up on that. I would talk my daughter into going to a different profession
Right.
in a million years, but you know what? There's no way I could ever talk her out
Mark,
of
I
it
wouldn't.
because
Mark,
there's
so my
just-
daughter's also, right, my daughter's also going into education.
Yeah.
And I've been 23 years in, and I know what it feels like to get those wins with kids, and I want that with her. So I've lived a life, and I would tell her, and I have told her, I'm incredibly proud of you, because this work is incredibly difficult, and you're not gonna make a lot of money, but I promise you, my exact words to her, I promise you, it's worth it, because you get the wins. And she will experience that, your daughter will experience the same. Everyone in this room have teachers by the hundreds that experience those wins. It is incredibly difficult, and we need to keep building our teachers. In truth, our teachers need to hear that we love them and support them, and we want to roll the red carpet out for them so they can go do that incredible work. And so that's the thing that we have to do to keep pushing them along, is to treat them as the folks who are doing the work out there, because they are doing it. It isn't by removing problems. It's by helping them find solutions along the way. That isn't the answer to the call. The answer is supporting and loving and encouraging them.
And Mark, I would say one of the things, one of the things that I think our teachers are feeling is the fact that as a public entity, there's a lot of legislative oversight. And so we hear from our teachers all the time, oh my God, it's one more thing. And they're right, because legislators are adding one more thing all the time. And there's no money to go with it. So high-dose tutoring, the science of reading. Like, let's name the things that the legislators are saying, and do this, and do this. And so our teachers are feeling overwhelmed, and it's legit. And it's not just the fact that it's what we're asking them to do on a daily basis, it's what's being piled on from everyone else. And I would agree that our teachers at the beginning of the pandemic were celebrated as heroes and have been, as public entities and public educators, are not just our teachers, but all of our staff, our bus drivers, our aides, have experienced the ire of society. And they do, not just our teachers, but our classroom assistants, our secretaries, our health assistants, every employee who walks the halls of our buildings, who works for this district, should be commended for the service that they are doing. And they don't hear it enough from people outside of this system, that they are valued for the work they're doing and the rewards that the community is going to reap on the back end for the quality of graduate that they're going to get.
Daryl, I think there might be, and excuse the difference here, but I think there's a little disconnect between perhaps myself and some of the younger. I don't see anybody here even close to my age. My 50th reunion is this summer for Colerain, class of '74. In my 3 years at Colerain, I never saw one fight. I never saw one marijuana cigarette. I saw teachers who had holes drilled in paddles, so if you acted out, they would beat your butt with that thing, and it would go faster because of the holes and hurt you more. And so I'm still maybe living back in that. But if you don't think that Nancy and I, working in the medical field, have seen a change with just the bureaucracy and what it's like when my grandpa, who was a family doctor, if you had a broken arm, he fixed that. If you needed a baby delivered, he fixed that. Now there's so many rules. If a family practitioner did that now, he'd not only probably lose his license, but he'd go to jail. Everything has changed. Look at the police, how they're so unappreciated. They want to be defunded. Cincinnati's down 250. I heard that today on the radio, of a 1,000-member police force. So it's just culture has changed, and I, for one, just can't put my fingers on spaces in classrooms. If I had tried that at Colerain High School in 1974, they'd have thrown me out the window.
It's a lot more inclusive, man. When
I was gonna say,
when I
yeah.
got into this, and I went to my dad, who was class of '76, not at Colerain, Tip City, but when I went in and I told my dad, hey, I want to go into special education. He's like, what? Brian Watkins didn't have that at Tip City High. You know, that wasn't the experience. Where'd they take those kids? And I use that term real specific, man. Because when we're talking about those kids or this, that, and the other, we're talking about a specific population of kids. And now that we've expanded and become more inclusive, I get to do my heart's passion. I get to work with students every day and help families every day. And I had to explain that to my dad because those kids went to a different space. You didn't see them. You didn't see them, Chris. You didn't see them because they weren't in your buildings.
They were in our buildings.
We have advocated for and progressed in this space to mean every kid every day. And it's inclusive, man. That's a beauty.
But they were in our buildings.
That's a beauty.
Yeah, well, I'm just telling you,
Yeah.
you know, when your dad graduated 2 years after me,
Yeah.
and so I know I don't look my age. I mean, I know I look 40, but I'm just telling you, some of us up here who are, 50 and above, just can't really. Some of this stuff is still, and I've been on the board 4 terms, and it's different when I first got on than it is now.
Your
Mark.
community's changed.
Absolutely.
Needs of the community have changed, right?
You asked about the B12 shot, right? What is that B12 shot? I can't speak for everybody else in this room. But I know when I look at Pleasant Run Middle School and I see a student who had severe behaviors when he was at Pleasant Run Elementary, when I look at the constant phone calls and the emergency removals and the discipline and the resources and the amount of adults that helped that child become who he is now. And I see him over at Pleasant Run Middle School, and now he's playing basketball. He's getting great grades. That's the B12 shot. Those are the kids. When Erin Davis sends her kids off to college and they come back and they're productive citizens and they come back, some of them come back to Northwest Local School District and they're teachers here. We don't get the money, the fame, we don't get that. But those kids that come back and they're successful, and you think of all the people that put the time and effort in to help that kid become where they are today, that's it right there. Like I said, I can't speak for everybody else, but for me,
I agree, but and I'm just saying this as like, are we taking the time and allowing our teachers, and you guys too, I mean, you're in the throes of this, obviously. Are we taking the time to make deposits in our emotional paycheck with that? Or are we moving so fast? And I'm not saying this judgmentally, I'm asking a question.
Yeah.
Like, are we really taking the time to understand what our successes are amongst ourselves versus, there's always gonna be this dichotomy in the community. People probably see education like I do, like it was, I graduated in '85. This is new. This whole process is different.
And I think that's what I would encourage all of you and all of the community to do. Come into our schools. Nothing will fill the buckets more than seeing the support of the community.
Well, that's why we
yeah.
wanted to do this kind of meeting,
Right.
because now
so
it's
come
recorded.
come meet the kids that are sitting in the calming corner and see how it's working for them. Nicole was at our building today. How much did the faces of our students light up when you handed them their headphones and told them what, we're rewarding them for those good. Exactly. So that's what I would encourage you to do. That's what I would encourage the community members that say that there's all these fights and all of this happening. Come into our buildings. Come see it. Stop listening to everybody else. Volunteer to read with our kids. Volunteer to do math facts. Volunteer to take walks or to shoot hoops with the kid that needs that 5-minute motor break. Come into our buildings. We are a public entity. We are in charge of educating everyone, and we need everyone for it. It has to stop being an us versus them type thing.
And it's hard every day,
Every day.
but you'll love it. I mean, I love going to work at Taylor Elementary every day. I love seeing my teachers teach their butts off. Our counselors work in an SEL setting, teaching these kids how to advocate for themselves who came from 3 different schools, and they're now able to speak about things that are happening to them that they need help with because they're in 1st grade. They don't know how to say it. It's awesome every day.
Every day.
It's hard. And I do think some teachers, they're experiencing their own trauma. They're human beings too. And so their parents, they're caring for elderly parents that are slowly passing away. So they come to school every day with their own baggage. So sometimes through relationships that we have with our staff, some of those teachers are dealing with their own issues. And then they have to get up in front of a class of 20, 25 and be there. And it is tiring, and sometimes they do break, and sometimes they do share, yell at us and say that's not enough, or what do you, they do fall apart. But I think through the consistency and the relationship you build, we're there for them as much as we are for the kids, and I would say, in retrospect, my staff's there for me as much as I am there for them. It goes both ways, but it's building those relationships.
What Gina said, it's not just what they bring from home, that they're human beings and they bring their whole self to work every day. But they're also here because you guys have all said educators have a special heart. They know every kid in their class by name, story, strength, and need, and those stories stay with them. And so they take these kids home with them in their heart and their soul. And we have staff members who are buying things for kids, who are giving them coats, who are doing things for kids because they know the needs of the kids. And so it's not just what's happening in their life that they bring with them, it's the fact that they might see 25 kids in an elementary classroom or 150 throughout the school day at a secondary level, but it's not like a traditional job where they leave it at the office. Those stories, those kids go home with them in their hearts every day. And that also creates some secondary trauma for our teachers because of what they know and what they experience with the students that they're supporting. And that needs to be called out and commended as well, because it's not just I'm teaching algebra, I'm teaching children. And they bring their whole selves to work as an employee every day, and our students bring their whole self to the class every day.
And that's what I mean by balance, right? So the teachers can keep pouring everything they've got, and nobody advocates for teachers like I do. I mean, I have tons of friends that teach in this district that I love dearly and would do anything for them. And I have gone and read, and I have rode buses, and I have done all this stuff. But we're a business, and I know people hate when I say that, but we're a business. We have limited resources, limited people, and we're constantly put in the vice day in and day out through our legislators and the government. And so you've only got so many widgets that you can use, whether that be loving on kids, spending extra time with them, somewhere. I just say this as a challenge. Like, there's got to be a balance, and I'm not saying it's out of balance. I don't know. I'm not in each of your buildings each day, but that miracle that teachers work with children, they have to be fully charged to be able to create that environment. And so I just say, you know, all the stuff that we talked about tonight is just, there's layers and layers and layers and layers. We'll have to take care of each other. And to me, that's critical, because as soon as, we're not gonna see academics raise until people are healthy, students are healthy, our teachers gotta be healthy before them numbers go up. And so,
Our teachers have to be able to bring their best selves to work, and we have to do what we can to make sure that
absolutely.
they have their best self in front of the kids. That's why we do as much as we possibly can to pour into them, but it's also when they get criticized for, hey, you got a summer break, hey, you got a week coming off. They also have a lot that they're unpacking during that time, emotionally as well as instructionally. And so it may look like to an outsider that, yeah, they get a lot of time off, but they're doing a lot to, one, emotionally recharge, but two, they're also taking classes, they're bettering themselves, they're planning, they're collaborating. There's a lot that happens in those downtimes, and some of it, like you said, Mark, it is an emotionally draining profession, and there have to be times for people to be able to recharge, to be able to be their best selves, to bring the best out of kids.
Well, as someone who is not that far from the principal job, I found that to be the most difficult piece of my job. Not the systems, the structures, but finding that balance. Because you have all these things that people are expecting. We want you to get behavior under control. We want student achievement raised. We want it all now. We're trying to figure all of those things, put systems in place. Here's a new legislative mandate. You're balancing it all the time thinking, what about my teachers? What about my teachers? What about my teachers? These administrators, anytime I come to them with something, they say, hold on, let me think about my teachers. How can we make this as easy as we can for them? What can I take off their plate in exchange for it? Or sometimes they're like, Lori, I can't do it. I am not gonna ask those teachers to do one more thing. Come up with another plan. So it is such a difficult balance, and it weighs on all of them when they leave here, because they know, today I didn't get to my teachers. Today I had to hold a grade level accountable for something that we have to do because it's going to lead to student achievement. And I know that I added more stress to their plate, but it's something that we have to do. And so then they think, okay, tomorrow, what can I do? You know, what can I provide? How can I walk around? What can I say? What can I shout out? What's the successes we've had in the building that we can celebrate so people realize that we are seeing changes, that what we do matters, and that we do have the ability to get different results out of things. It is the hardest job of the administration position, by far, is figuring out that balance and keeping every little plate up in the air while trying to keep kids happy, staff happy, your bosses happy, the board happy, the community happy, your families happy. You have to do it all, and it's very difficult.
Well, I can say that I'm the only one up here who was ever a school teacher. I taught for a year at a very good private school, Seton High School. And to tell you, there's so many more moving pieces now than, I made $9,500 a year. That tells you how long ago it was. And it was just a one-year job teaching math. And there's the moving pieces. There's so many, like you said, the legislative, the board, the community, the media. The big thing, I put a post on about our plan that was publicly announced and the responses, and you're gonna rename that school, aren't you? No, you can't rename it. I mean, social media, I mean, that didn't exist. And there's just so much more now to make it so much harder and complicated. But I know how hard the job can be, even though I was in a school where the kids paid to go there, and the principal had final say. If somebody was bad, she could just, you're not coming back. There was no board that she had to go through. And I enjoyed it. It was a great job, but I don't think it's anything what I experienced to what you guys are in public education 40 years later. I just don't. I don't think it's even close. That's all I have to say.
I appreciate everybody coming, because we never have an opportunity to literally put all the players in one room. And I think this is gonna be a great video for people to watch, to get an understanding of like, what is it really like? And I think I'll speak for the five of us. We're here to support you 100%. No questions asked. We come from a different prism though. We're looking out, looking in, while you guys are in, looking out. So that's why I think these do very well, that we get an opportunity to just talk things through. Like, you don't get that opportunity. And in the time that we are in the buildings, it's not really enough time to really understand what's going on by any means. You have to live in the building. I told Casey one day, when we were doing the float, I said, "You're the CEO of Taylor Elementary. You're the CEO. You're Chief Executive Officer. You run the place." Like, that's an immense amount of responsibility, and that's for each of you here. So, you know, I appreciate everything that you guys do. I really do.
As we close, I want to say thank you to the board for even engaging in the conversation, being willing to sit and talk and listen to what our administrators do. That shows a lot, that we have a board that is not only engaged, but willing to be a part of the conversation, to listen. And I appreciate that, and I know that our administrators appreciate the fact that they have a seat at the table and that you guys are actually willing to be at the table with them to listen. I will shout out that we have around this table amazing administrators. As a district, we should be extremely proud of not just the administrators we have, the teachers, the staff. We have amazing things happening. This group of people around this table bear the weight of the world on their shoulders every day. They balance it gracefully. They don't let it show to their staff. They are true leaders that I respect immensely, and am proud to say that I sit at a table with a group of people like this who have the heart for the job, but they also have the lens of not just systems, but people. And so I think as a district, I hope that if people do watch this, they walk away understanding and proud of the work that we're doing and the people that we have, and have confidence in, and I know I do, the decisions that come out of this group of people, the authority they have of their building, the leadership of their staff, the influence they have on children. We should be extremely proud of it as a district, that we have the caliber of administrators that we do in this district. And I can't say enough for the people around this table. So thanks to the board for being a part of this, and thank you to all of you for another late night, and for the open, honest conversation, and for what you do on a daily basis.
I just want to thank everyone too for being here. And nobody speaks higher of what you guys are doing than me. And I agree with Marley. I know what level 0 is, level 1, I've heard it multiple times just today alone. And the kids know exactly what to do when those things are said. And when somebody says Struble, the whole class says Blue Jays. And it's just the ways that you guys build the relationships. And I just appreciate you coming and sharing. I really enjoyed hearing from you, Kristen, and what you're doing, and how you guys are just we're not giving up on kids. We are helping them find their next achievement, and just please don't get discouraged, and just appreciate everything you guys do. So thank you guys, and thank you for the presentation and everything. So, and I would encourage everyone sitting at this table to get to a school and see the great things
Are
that
we
are
allowed
going
to
on.
just go? I was under the impression we had to go
Yeah,
with the
yeah.
superintendent.
Yeah, you would
You
call me.
can volunteer anytime at any school in this district.
Yeah, so if you want to volunteer, you would go through the HR process to actually apply to be a volunteer. If you want to go and visit, then you would reach out to me and we would schedule those times to go visit and tour and see the buildings. So it's kind of twofold. If you're going to as a volunteer, you go through a volunteer process, but if you want to go as a board member to see what's going on, then it would come through me.
But there are cafeterias, need people, libraries, there's plenty of ways, and that builds relationships with the kids too, and you'll get to see the great things that they're doing. So, thank you.
Hold on, Nicole, you need to,
A motion.
Oh, yeah, motion to.
sorry.
So moved. Second.